do the groundworks, which would have cost millions.
Because I deliver plots in groups, and I also work with people like Wimples in Bishop's Castle, put together Wimples, and obviously the private finance from the private model housing pays for the other parts.
Right.
I wonder whether there might be a way of kind of rescuing it before Lars and Jonathan sold the land on, so that it could have been flipped around, so you still could have got what you needed. You spent 7 years invested, I imagine emotionally.
Absolutely.
Quite devastating to let go of.
It was. It was. There were a few tears. Yeah.
I was at the planning committee when it got approved.
Yeah, we got planning first time, which is virtually unheard of. We made the front page of the Hereford News. It was.
I was there, but I couldn't believe that it was approved because it was against all the policies they had.
Exactly.
And it didn't sound as if it kind of had been worked through to the point where it could be delivered. So if you're looking at it from a kind of a
Right.
perspective, it always sounded like it was too good to be true.
Okay.
And I know Lars a little bit, so Lars was Jonathan's business partner, so
You know Lars. Lovely. Yes. Yeah.
I know that it was a complicated thing to set up, but it's almost maybe too big.
Okay.
To get through, but if you tried again on a smaller scale, it might be something that
So.
would be more deliverable.
So what I saw from my side was that visually the project looked incredibly impressive, and from your side, obviously, you saw that financially it didn't look secure.
Yes, because the manufacturing side of it, which was core to everything, so Jonathan and Lars, I presume, had a lot of vested interest in having that factory.
Yeah.
That's a huge expense. I have my own house factory, if you like, but it's an expensive thing to set up from scratch, to go from 0 to 250 houses.
Yeah.
Is breaking all market kind of conventions. So I can see,
Yeah.
lots of people were concerned. I think my concern was 250 houses in a village is not very easy to absorb for that community anyway. But also, what happens if it falls into the wrong hands, which is what has happened. And if you go to Kingston now, you will see that it's upsetting. As a Herefordian, I find it upsetting that was how it happened, and it was not even, there was no protection to the approval that meant it had to be something nice. So it was, in the end, it was money that kind of change people's minds, if you like. So the value of the site was so inflated by what had been given. There's no other village.
Sorry.
No other village that I know of in Herefordshire that was given permission for 250 houses. So it's kind of everything about it felt a bit, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I know Kingston slightly, and as far as I know, there are no affordable houses on that site.
But there are, yeah.
Oh, there are.
Yeah, there are, yeah.
There would have been with our passive houses.
How much?
Yeah.
So I think in Kingston it would have been between 30 and 40%, so it's a significant number.
Yeah.
Oh, they'll have different models, so they would have been told by Herefordshire Council what kind of affordable housing they have to have. So that could be shared ownership, it could be discounted market. In fact, I think they were built before discounted market came in, but there would have been housing association houses there as well.
What was it?
So
How
Herefordshire-
expensive?
Oh,
How cheap?
well, they're based on local wages. If they're for sale, then they're based on the local wages. So they have to be.
80% of they're 80% of the market rents.
There's different types of affordable housing. So you'd have, if you were buying the house, then you'd only be able to purchase up to 75, 80%. But then that value has to be governed by local wages. So they can't say, oh, that house is worth £500,000, pay me 80% of the 500,000. It has to be checked back against local wages. So they are affordable in the sense that they're controlled by a mechanism that means they're affordable in perpetuity. So they will always be available to somebody with an affordable housing need.
You only got to have one billionaire in the village that becomes unaffordable.
Sorry?
You only got to have one billionaire in the village that becomes unaffordable.
What does, sorry?
80%. Well, if you have a billionaire who lives in a village for the local wage cap becomes
Oh, no. The local wage is set by Herefordshire Council again, so they take actual figures of your local wage and then they calculate how much that would mean you could afford in either a mortgage or in rent.
So social housing included.
I don't know what the makeup was at Kingston, I'll be honest, I don't
If you
know.
look at the labour market in Herefordshire, £20,000 a year is a good wage for
Yeah,
Herefordshire.
it is low wages.
I don't expect many of these houses would have been on sale for 80,000 or 90,000 quid.
So you have to remember there's two different types. I don't know Kingston well enough to know
There
exactly,
would
but
have
there
been
will be-
a social housing provision,
yes.
yes.
There'll be two types of housing on the scheme of 250. Anything over 10 units has to have a certain amount of
Well, I appreciate all
social
that, but the
housing.
point I'm making is that if
So
you local, for lack of a better word, wage of 16, 18, 19, 20,000 a year,
Yes.
the only way you'll get an affordable house in Herefordshire, i.e. a house which you can afford, very simplistic definition, is if we start building the sort of houses that I grew up in, council houses.
Exactly.
Yes,
It's the only
so
answer.
the council take the average wage, which I think in Herefordshire, somebody's going to know better than me, is about £19,000 average. And then they assume that if you're a single person, your mortgage capability would be 3.5 times that. But actually they base them on your rent. So affordable housing with a capital A and a capital H, which we might know as social housing or discounted market housing, whatever definition you give it, is controlled by the average wage of Herefordshire people. So
Affordable housing is not social housing.
no, that's what I'm saying. That's why I gave you lots of different categories, because
Yeah.
they're different things.
So
But then
the rent
those
charge,
types are controlled by the wages. The market housing, which you could buy through an estate agent, is controlled by the market, not by people's ability to afford that house.
affordable rents are 80% of the market rents, and I believe council social homes are 55% of the market rents.
One of the other things that is relevant, especially today, is that with things like triple glazing and it would have had, the walls would have been lined with crushed paper, which would have been an incredible insulation. We were quoted that an annual electricity bill would have been £50. So the passive design was considerably saving on finances.
It's affordable to live in as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
That you can afford to live in the house that you've got.
Yeah.
Can I ask, am I going to try it somewhere else? I mean, is it a project that should be part of our mixed idea of housing? Because let's face it, I'm here scribbling notes because we're here to listen and to learn. That's what the evening's meant to be, really. But do you think it's something that we should put back into the mix? Because I presume that it hasn't been tried anywhere else across the county. Or is it anywhere, apart from Stroud, which has passive houses, is it? Of this style?
Stroud were individuals that brought in their own money for their own property, whereas our project was Archie House creating the development, and we were a part of that first phase. So it's a different model. As far as I know, there are a few small communities around, and they work in different ways. So, for instance, they might buy a huge older property and divide it. We just particularly wanted to build something that was more sustainable and using less resources.
Is it something kind of adoptable by the council as a principle? I don't know.
It is, and that's why I understood that we got planning first go. I mean, we were surprised ourselves, but it was such a forward-thinking model that.
So Ellie's coming later, but she'll explain. So the Herefordshire's council house delivery model they've just adopted is only passive house. So it's not necessarily co-housing, which I think yours is interesting because it was co-housing.
It was both,
and
yeah.
passive.
Yeah.
But the council's own delivery of council housing, they've already agreed they're only going to build passive house plus.
Excellent.
So if they
That's
deliver
solid.
any, then
But that's only for the social housing. I think the difficulty that this shows is that there's a lag between building regulations and technology. And very often, building regulations are set at a time when emerging technologies aren't well understood and often seem quite expensive. Whereas, we've all seen the cost of solar panels and various other things come down quite significantly. We're hoping the same happens with air mass heaters. All those sort of things get cheaper over time, but building regulations are set so far in advance. So we're still working to building regs 2015, and yet in that 7 years, so much has moved on. And I think the difficulty is unless you can change the building regulations so that all housing gets closer to passive house, we're still going to have situations where, and the difficulty is it's in construction companies' interests to reduce the building regulations because it reduces their costs and maximises their profits. It's in the interests of people like Worcester Bosch to continue to sell gas boilers until hydrogen becomes available so they can convert to hydrogen boilers. So you have so many vested interests in building regulations But unless we have control of those building regulations, and that's where it should be a political issue, you know, that's where locally it's very difficult to do anything about building regulations. Herefordshire Council can't really do anything about that. But they could set in the strategic housing land availability assessment certain requirements for builders to build to a certain code, and maybe that code needs to be higher than the minimum for building regulations.
Yes. My fear ultimately, and I'm just conscious of time, and Mary, I was hoping because you could speak next, if that's okay, over there, well, I did over here, is that ultimately what went wrong with your project is what was in the news at the start of the week, wasn't it? That too often, you know, the council have these great promises, and we'll maybe quiz Ellie on this, but ultimately what tends to happen is that type of housing tends to get sidelined, and what ends up being built is not what was promised in the first place. And I understand that there's lots going on this evening, I know there's a couple of meetings going on, and, you know, but I'm just amazed that, you know, people don't take this more seriously in some respects, because what haven't been built opposite them, or the house that they hope to move into, really does matter.
And I think I mean, Mandorla predates Community Homes England and Homes England, really, you know, to some extent. And Homes England kind of came out of that. And much of the funding that's gone into the Affordable Homes Programme and into community-led housing was not around when Mandorla was being envisaged. I mean, it's fair to say that absolutely the rug was pulled underneath it from not signing the contract for the groundworks. That's what scuppered it. And now that's where the grants that are available in the Affordable Homes Programme, you have to be a registered provider, you have to be an approved partner with Homes England in order to have access to those funds.
And you're saying that too many of these approved home people are...
Well, the problem is this, status. You either have a community land trust and go through the process of becoming an approved partner, or you have to be a fairly major developer to get approved status, or a housing association. And that's very difficult for 21 people to become a housing association or to become a registered provider. And that barrier is set quite high, and it's probably deliberately set quite high, because it allows for large vested interests to come in and control that market. What we need to see is much smaller developments of community-led housing that can be built, things like self-build plots. You know, every local authority has to provide self-build plots, but very few really will tell you where they are. You have to join a register. It's quite a complicated process to get on that ladder. But wherever there is housing being built, there should be self-build plots. And that gives people the opportunity to reduce the costs of building. It gives them the chance to build to higher standards. But it's not cost effective. And the Section 106 money in Herefordshire only go to Herefordshire Council. So they're only interested in the gains of Section 106 to Herefordshire Council, not the local community. So it's not in their interest to build small developments.
That's quite secure now. I'm a councillor, and we have proposed about the primary, which is quite odd. But I don't entirely agree that that is the current practice concerning Section 106 money. Certainly think it was under the last administration.
Well, I mean, but you won't get. I mean, in theory, I work across both Herefordshire and Worcestershire. We have district councils. Worcestershire, Herefordshire is a unitary authority. And there is no doubt that its district councils, they keep the Section 106 going, and that means that the money tends to stay in more local areas. Whereas, you know, and the higher percentage of the Section 106 goes back to those communities. In Herefordshire, it is a case that they haven't adopted the local infrastructure levy. And that's a political decision. The local infrastructure levy was there to improve the infrastructure in communities. So we talk about Kingstone, which is not a village that was able to sustain that amount of housing. It didn't have any schools, doesn't have any GP surgeries, doesn't have access to hospitals, hasn't got enough transport. All those things.
But it does now. It's been built since. It's all been built since.
But the problem with that is that you don't have the local infrastructure levy money that would put those things into that community. You're dependent on the Section 106 money, and that is a political decision.
Just conscious of time. Any final points you want to say about? Hope to the future. Yeah. Hope to the future.
Well, as a group, we've all separated now, and people are doing their individual projects, and we are in fact looking for land. So my partner and I would love to build something passive house for ourselves. So we haven't lost the dream. We're just, as you say, going smaller. Yeah.
And there is good, and there are 28 houses approved by the Commission in Much Birch, which is a co-housing project, and that similarly has £4.5 million worth of groundworks. But they have got access to the Homes England money in a way that you did not have that access to that. And so it's likely that those houses are more likely to be achieved.
Yeah.
So things have moved on.
And that's wonderful. And they've possibly learned from what we went through and been able to progress with much more ease. Yeah.
I think what it is, it's kind of connecting projects and people and places.
Yeah.
You know, you realise that there's a pattern that's already been done, because too often it happens a little bit in isolation, I think, is also a factor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.
Cheers. Do you mind, Mary? Do you go there? Or are you going to... Yeah. I love upside down working. So I'm going to bowl it, because there's no way just to... let's make it happen. Wow. How does it even work?
Just go into, have you got a USB?
Yeah.
Pull it out now.
Easier said than done. You do it, because you're very grateful. Yeah, this is... See? Oh, that was let's make it happen. No. It's just what am I? How does it What was that? I'm joking. That was beautiful picture. It's techy. It's going to happen. Oh, look at that. Tells you what's coming up next. It's amazing, isn't it?
Well, you say that, I can surely break it. Technology is not amazing. Am I going to be in the way of these things?
I realise that's not the best setup, is it?
Shall I sit down?
Yeah. Pick you up. Yeah, make it happen. Oh, sorry. Oh, you can... Want to introduce yourself?
No, I've got an introduction slide. That is actually me. My name is Mary Albright, and I work for a company called Broad Oak. I'm based in North Herefordshire. I work for my father, who started Broad Oak in 1980. I'm called a creative director, but because I work for my dad, I was allowed to choose whatever name I wanted. So really what I do is quite a lot of design work, quite a lot of planning work, and then stick my nose into local strategies and things like that. I'm a parish councillor in Herefordshire. Oh, sorry. Do I have to say it all again? No. I'm also a parish councillor in the village I was born in, and I am a member of the Nutrient Management Board quite by accident, in that my cousin and I, when the housing moratorium was issued in 2019, my cousin, who's a local architect, and I decided that we had been in this position before, and the best thing to do was try and be positive about helping find a solution. And part of that became that we set up the Herefordshire Construction Industry Lobby Group, which represents small local construction companies, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, kitchen makers, that kind of sector, in the sense that we try and find solutions for endless problems, but primarily phosphates. So that's who I am, roughly. So Broad is a family business. So my mum and dad still own it, and my husband is my boss, technically, and my sister works there, but we also have lots of other people's families. So we have lots of mothers and sons, teams of brothers, cousins, that kind of idea. So We're not all related because there are about 90 of us, so I promise I have got a lot of cousins, but then they're not all at Border Oak. But the ethos of what we do is we are a family business building family homes. So I try and use homes rather than housing wherever I can, simply because it kind of communicates more what we're doing, because we focus on the self-build and custom build market. So thank you very much for dropping that in before. It's a very seamless introduction. And the idea of that is that we are commissioned to build a house that somebody needs or wants in a location that they choose for the budget that they have to spend. I found this slide and I just thought it was interesting because I knew that affordability would come up. These figures are based on market housing as opposed to social affordable housing. But it's quite interesting that the majority of housing in Herefordshire is under the £250,000 mark. There are obviously notable examples where it goes into bigger amounts of money, but primarily you're looking at kind of a middle market type of sector. I've put on a few figures there just because, again, unless you're Herefordian and you're obsessed with stats like I am about Herefordshire, you can't really put into context what we are. So basically, we're a huge county in terms of area, and we're a tiny county in terms of population. So I think the Isle of Wight is smaller than us, and Rutland. So in the whole of the, I don't know, there are 48 counties in England, something like that. We're number 3 in terms of population. That is lovely, and that's why I choose to live here after I went to university in Bristol. But it does mean that we're always going to have a problem with how much money we have coming in from people in terms of taxes and how many facilities we can offer. I thought the average age of 44.7 was a bit lower than I thought it was. And I don't know why I put on there that 12,400 people live in Leominster, but that's the biggest market town, so it gives you an idea of the scale of the market towns. There are 88,000 homes in Herefordshire, and on average we build around about 500 to 600 new homes every year. So we have a persistent under-delivery of housing, and we've had that all the time that I've been working, which is about, well, 25 years-ish. So we under-deliver for the need that we have existing, the unidentified need, and then the government's centrally derived housing figures. We are catching up a little bit. We've had a couple of good years where there have been some really big developments in Ledbury and Ross. I'm sure you all know the ones. And they have turned the figures a little bit, but I don't think we're probably on board to catch up with what we've lost, but also to maintain that kind of level of housing delivery going forward. We do, Border Oak, we work all over the country, but we used to do about 50% of our work in Herefordshire and other parts, the rest of it. And if you told people that you delivered 500 homes a year, they would just fall off their chair laughing, because an average development in the southeast, for example, is 5,000 homes. So just to give you an idea of kind of numbers we're looking at are quite small, which on the one hand explains some of the problems we might have as a county, but on the other hand it means that the solutions we probably all want to find, we can actually achieve them because it's small enough to be manageable. So if we could find out why things happened one way or how we would like them to happen another way, we've probably got control over our market in the sense that we can actually make policies to secure the achievements we would want. Very quickly, I'll just touch on this as a sense of what are the hurdles in Herefordshire. Now, there are loads and loads of hurdles. Planning is a huge hurdle. Finding land is a huge hurdle. Brexit and COVID, not so much. Phosphates is an absolute catastrophe. And there's lots of reasons why it's a catastrophe. But if you look at the picture of the river on the right, that's Erdersland, I don't know if you can see. So there was a day in April last year where I was getting, my phone was just going off the hook, and basically the river was running orange with muddy water. Now, there are loads of incidents that have happened on the river, you know, not just the Arrow, but the Lug and everything else. So the phosphate pollution we have has stopped housing approvals for 3 years in 40% of your county. So on one hand, I know people don't always like housing, and it sounds like, oh, what's a good thing, developers can't build. But the complexities of what has happened as a result of that are actually quite devastating, and that would be anything from the south of the county having to take a lot more housing than they might have done because we can't build in the top half, It might be that the local school in my village didn't have enough pupils and lost a teaching assistant. You know, these are real things that are happening, and the ripple effect of that will continue for a couple of years yet. But from a selfish point of view, not being able to get planning in my own county for 3 years on sites I already owned or were kind of halfway through progressing has been catastrophic.
Is that mostly because of the issue of surface runoff rather than sewerage?
So when I first got involved, that's a really good question, because it's really hard to communicate this, and the narrative has changed, but every time it kind of gets established as what's actually gone wrong, somebody comes along and it gets muddled up again. So when we first had the moratorium issued on October the 15th, 2019, we were told that it was 50% coming from sewage treatment works from existing housing and 50% coming from agriculture. My cousin and I thought, well, that's terrible. Neither of us want to be involved in an industry where we are polluting the rivers. I don't want to do that. I'm young enough to put a bit of energy into this and see where we can get to on a solution. So we thought, let's get everybody together. What do you want us to do? It quickly transpired, probably by the following January, when we joined the Nutrient Management Board, the percentage of pollution coming from housing was about 23%. So that's primarily from the 88,000 existing homes and some sewage treatment works. Not all, but some. And then the 60 odd percent it is, but it's gone up to about 70% now, was coming from agriculture.
And nobody's stopped anybody farming?
Yes. By then they had issued the moratorium, and there quickly turned out there was no solution on the table to A, get housing back working, but also to stop the pollution that was already existing. So I keep saying to people, we're not in a position where stopping housing will fix anything. It won't. There's not enough contribution. The contribution from new homes is about 0.2%. So new homes would deliver about 0.2% of the phosphate load in the lug. But no changes were made to the other sector, and no changes are looking likely to be made in the other sector. So I'm in the position where it's highly likely I'll be stuck in a moratorium for the next 3, 4, 5 years. And again, people might think, well, that's good because housing can't be built. But there are loads of reasons why we do need housing. We need all sorts of different types of housing, but we also do need children that can go into schools, and we need nurses that can live here so they can work in the hospital. So it's a really social problem. But I would hope, and I know, again, it's a complicated thing, but I would hope people wouldn't want to see carpenters, bricklayers, plumbers, electricians vanish out of Herefordshire and all the money they generate flood out with them. So it's something that I wish that people could understand had problems for all of us. But in the meantime, I'll just keep going and keep bothering people at meetings and nagging people. The picture on the other side, I know it's a terrible Google Earth picture, but I just wanted to explain that people like me, I don't want to be reliant on somebody else to provide me with a solution. I don't want a handout. I don't want somebody to kind of have the job of paying for the solution. I'm happy to do it myself. And so what we did is we were told that, when we realised it was agriculture, we were told that one of the best things you could do is maybe buy an intensive farm and close it down so it didn't contribute phosphates. So my dad very kindly said, okay, you've got a bit of money to go and find a site where you can do that and try and do something really positive. So we stitched together a small holding of a intensive cattle farm, which you can just see in the bottom. It's like that big concrete square. If you can imagine, on there were two very large industrial cattle units, and there's a brook just running straight the way through the farmyard. So this is when you realise why things were causing a problem. And we had actually worked with the landowner on the scheme that's the kind of under construction bit to the other side of it. Now, I had worked with him for a long, long time, so I was able to negotiate with him on the kind of self-build plots that we thought the village might like. So we worked with the parish council, with the neighbours, with the landowner. We agreed, he very kindly agreed to my suggestion that they give the village a couple of acres as their community space, which is that big square between there and the cemetery. This is in Yarpole, by the way. And then we did 9 self-build plots. And it's everything from a single lady on her own who's built her own house, Roxy, to families, to retired people, all sorts of different types of house. There's modern houses, traditional houses. Like I say, some self-build where somebody's actually done the work themselves. Others are what we call custom build, where they've commissioned Border Oak to build it. Some of them are a mixture of those two things. Now, We bought that farmyard because of the phosphates, but we also bought it because we didn't want it going into a speculative development, because we had promised our clients this wonderful scheme of 9 self-built houses with a community field, all the rest of it, and I didn't want to let them down. And that other site, which had planning for 7 kind of estate-type houses on it, to go to the wrong hands, because as we know, Kingston is hard to undo. Once planning's granted, it's really hard to claw it back. And the farmer also let me buy a 4-acre field just south of there so that I could put an orchard and meadow on. So it's all looking really good. And then phosphates came along, but I thought, well, I've got the cattle yard, so I knew that was a problem. So we've worked out how much phosphate we save and how it's about 250 houses worth of phosphate. But can I get it through Herefordshire Council's system? No, I can't. It's kind of sitting there. I'm really hoping that somebody will help me out here, because I need 6 houses worth of phosphate, and I've hopefully can save between 200 and 250. But also that site is a brownfield site. It's on a village where you've got a shop, a church, village, you know, all the things you would like to have a village. It's all walkable. So it's a good site in terms of how you would kind of decide whether a site was good or not. And it can solve my own phosphate problem. So some developers do things differently, and I'm not trying to say that I'm the best or anything like that. There are loads of us in Herefordshire that are doing these kind of things, but obviously the development market gets kind of, all the attention might go to a bigger developer or a national developer, and their self-build and custom build and small-scale schemes are very, very, very different to the big guys. This is just a really quick example of, this is a scheme in Stoke Prior. It had planning for the one on the coloured one there, which was 8 units, 2 affordable houses, and then, bizarrely, an orchard and a kind of pond attenuation thing over the other side of the scheme. And we bought it, and then Herefordshire changed how they were asking for affordable housing, and they basically didn't want to have affordable housing on small schemes, which there are loads of reasons for that, but I won't go in for it. Not they didn't want, but it was really difficult to manage, and the legislation said you didn't have to provide social housing on schemes under 10 units. So this scheme then kind of fell into the different category, which was a small-scale development. So we went back to the council and said, could we change the scheme? They said, yeah, that was fine. They still wanted to have 8 units because it was against their housing targets, and they'd kind of accounted for that. I went to the parish council, and they said, yeah, that's fine, we're happy for you to have it. However, we've adopted a neighbourhood plan, and there are now things you need to do that are slightly different. So again, what we did there is we worked with the parish council and this emerging plan, and what Herefordshire Council said was their kind of base level changes for it, and tried to turn it into something that we could deliver as a self and custom build scheme. So on the scheme that we have done, there are 5 self-build plots, and we service them. So we put the driveways in, we put the electrics, the highways, Wi-Fi connections and all of that. That's it's all service, it's ready to go. What they call them shovel ready, which is a terrible phrase, but so we pay for all of that, and then the plots get sold to individuals, and then we project manage the whole scheme, so everybody knows what's going to happen, and there's a bit of certainty to it actually happening. And then what we did is, rather than have the orchard like tacked onto the side, we brought it into the middle of the site, so that every property gets the benefit of the community orchard in the middle of the plot. And it's something you drive through, and rather than having tarmac and that kind of cul-de-sac arrangement on the drive, we kind of had it so that it was more of a street, so that the idea is that you would come out and you probably are going to see your neighbour, or you're going to have a chat about, did you see the deer last night running in the orchard, or whatever it might be, just to try and add a bit of social interaction to the site. And then there was no need for that attenuation pond, so we turned it into a biodiversity area, and the private drainage plant is in there with a wetland, so that it's again cleaning the tertiary treatment after it's been treated in the thing. And then the other part we did is, rather than having the 2 social houses that we couldn't get a partner to take on, we then built a terrace of 3 2-bedroom barn. They look like one barn, but they're 2-bedroom properties. And obviously it's very hard to get a self-builder to build a terrace of houses. So Border Oak built those. We did one of them as a custom finish, so the young couple came in and they then chose their own kitchens and flooring. And in those, at the moment, you've got a young couple, a teacher and an opera singer, and we built him a soundproof shed so he can practice. You've got an agricultural contractor and a nurse in the middle one, and then a retired lady in the end. Now, I can't control who buys those houses, but because they're terraced, because they're 2-bedroom, they can't be extended, and because they have shared parking, their market value is controlled a little bit by what they will ever be worth. So hopefully that's a kind of a good middle way of securing housing that's kind of got positive contribution to the village. But then also the self-build houses are all there as plots, service plots, and we've just planted the orchard. It's only gone in recently. But there's also over 2 miles of hedging gone in, whereas the other scheme had no hedging. So very little grass, no hedging, a lot of tarmac, those kind of things. So I just try to unpick the bits that I can do. Now, lots of this is because I live here and I would like my children to live here, and I don't want to drive past schemes I thought, oh, you probably shouldn't have done that, or you could have done better. And I'm not saying we get it right every time, but there's a lot of effort going into try and making it better if we can. And that is in another local village at exactly the same time this was being built as our scheme in Stoke Prior. And I just wanted to give a kind of a contrast to where the differences lie. Now it's not bad or anything like that, but a couple of trees down that main street would have really set it off. Speaking about air source heat pumps, that scheme is all on air source heat pumps, even the 2-bed houses. And the reason we could do that is because we had a loft space and we put the units in there, because they're actually quite small. They're about, I think they're 66 square metres, but I'd have to double check that. But they'd be too small for the unit required for an air source heat pump. So we put them into the loft.
So Mary,
Yes.
why don't more homes in Redrow and Wimpy incorporate these things into their schemes? And what's the difference in margin from a development like yours and that sort of development?
Yeah, good question. So I think they do in other areas. So if you're like me and you have nothing better to do on a weekend, you might drive to the Cotswolds or to Worcester and look at what other people are doing. And the difference with, especially in the Cotswolds and Gloucestershire and Somerset, what they make their big developers do, their volume builders do, is quite impressive.
Who makes them do that?
The local authority make them do that.
So the county council in
Yes.
Gloucestershire or in Oxfordshire
Yes.
with the Cotswolds?
Yes. So that can be the only way that they are making those people build low stone walls and putting in trees with grids around the bottom for watering, loads of things like that. So I would say that it's forced upon them, but also they're getting quite good value for those houses. So
So is it that premium? Is it the fact that it's the Cotswolds that house is going to sell for 780,000 instead of 340,000?
possibly,
But
but
it's
then when you
funding
look
that-
at their sales figures, they're not that different to a big estate in Hereford. So I'm not sure. But there's definitely somebody working out what makes a good street scene. How do you make a sense of place? How do you... often Herefordshire developments look... they kind of have... they're like what you call inward looking. So rather than kind of thinking, this is our community and this is our street, they kind of, this is my garden and this is my shed. And so they have a different psychology to them. And lots of the modern developments I see going up in the Cotswolds are very different. They're much more orientated around a central green, for example, or something like that. Yeah, but it's a good question. But I think you could, again, because I represent these developers, I'm not just saying this because I like them all, but they're not resistant. If somebody said you must have hedging, not close bordered fencing, they'd say that's fine.
But that's a planning issue. And in terms of
Yes.
planning, what is the problem with political leadership that insists on having design statements that comply with that, and local planning officers that simply apply the policy to the applications that they receive? They don't ever
Yeah.
interpret it.
I don't know, because I have terrible trouble getting my schemes through planning, so I'm not probably the right person to
So
ask.
we've got
'Cause
the wrong planners.
no, there's some of them are really. I think there's some really good ones. Yeah.
I don't want to make excuses for the current council, but I suspect most of the stuff
Go on,
that's
yeah,
going
go
up
ahead.
now was granted planning permission
Yeah.
a few years ago.
I think so, and I think the danger we have now is kind of because I hear some of the comments come out of the planning committee, and they're quite fruity comments about people's schemes. There was one that just sticks in my mind. It's not one of mine, but it was 4 cabins in a North Herefordshire village, and they were as eco as you could. Literally, they were the dream. Everything you can imagine, and they were for tourism, but they were just on the edge of a village, and they would have brought good money in and all the rest of it. And I think the committee refused it because there wasn't a train station to that village, and therefore people would be using their electric car to get here. So you've got, because people are a bit cheesed off with the kind of developments that might have got through previously, maybe the pendulum's going too far, and therefore we might end up cutting our nose off to spite our face, because government housing delivery targets won't have any sympathy. They will say, no, you're supposed to deliver 800 homes, where are they? And that's when the big developers who've got options on loads of different things that we don't know about, they'll just go, well, here's your 400 houses, and they don't ask them to do anything better.
Obviously, aesthetics are important, and what they do seems really lovely, but when we look at planning and look at the aesthetics of housing and where we're located in the housing, we do seem to miss one fairly important aspect. That's the idea that we're providing housing for need.
Mm-hmm.
If you're living on your own with a couple of kids, with mum and dad in Hinton, you basically got somewhere to rent.
Yeah.
And we've had our kids living with us for some years, but they're lucky. We're not exactly poor. We give one a plot of land. And after a lengthy battle with planning, we don't like people building a single house in the countryside, having low impact on a plot of land. They want to have big developers building big estates to attract people in from London and Birmingham. A little bit of bias there, a bit of Herefordian parochialism. But if we were living on Hinton, in a rented accommodation, working on a minimum wage, having just retired given our age from a job on a minimum wage, on a 0 hours contract, we could have done nothing for our kids.
Yeah.
And they and all the other kids in their position
Yes.
are just crying out for somewhere they can either afford, they won't be able to afford to buy anything out, because you're really silly about it. They're crying out for something they can afford to rent.
Yeah.
And having become an accidental landlord from parents, you know, they can let them as son. I know what the property rental market's like in America.
So,
It starts at about £550, £600 a month now.
So a lot of that comes back down to the fact that we haven't delivered enough houses, because the market is skewed by lack of the demand and the supply are
government
different.
support for people buying houses, which has simply shoved the prices up. The market's been skewed by fiscal policy, which has poured money into the money supply at a time when there was no demand for capital to invest, and all that money went to fuel the housing market, so prices went through the roof. We need houses to rent built by local authorities, otherwise these people have got no chance of getting a house.
There's been 20 billion spent on help to buy up until last August, since the scheme started. It's still continuing. We all know that stamp duty was suspended for a long time, or reduced, because somehow somebody thought that house prices might go down, it'd be a bad thing. House prices have been kept artificially high, and it's involved a lot of subsidy from our government, or us. At the same time, we pay 22 billion a year in housing benefit, and during this period that we've spent 20 billion on Help to Buy, there's been 8 billion spent on social housing of any sort. So we have at the moment political masters who are determined to keep house prices high, and because of the changes that are taking place elsewhere in the housing market, most people who are renting are now private renters, not social tenants, and they are exposed to the market issues. So rents are high, and somehow, I mean, it's a political question that's beyond what we can do in Herefordshire. We need to break this cycle.
Well, and certainly in terms of fair rent, that doesn't exist in.
No, well, I can remember when there were
and yet places like Cornwall are looking at reimposing things like fair rents and rents that are proportionate to local incomes, and that's not allowing second homes that are let out as Airbnbs, because that should be made available to local people who can afford to rent those properties. But I think you raise a really important issue about the quality of housing needs assessments. And has anybody seen a standard housing needs survey recently, or even filmed one in?
Yeah. I keep an eye on them, but
But they only ask questions about how many people, how old are they, how many are in school, who expects to leave in the next 3 years.
Yeah.
You know, they are very blunt tools, and they're not very good at predicting that need, which is what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Would any housing needs survey have asked the question, do you expect to work from home for the next 3 years?
Yeah.
Well, no, they wouldn't. But that's the problem with a housing needs assessment, and it's a problem with the strategic and land availability assessment, is that they are not sophisticated tools. They're very blunt tools, and they don't allow for sophisticated quality developments. They are geared towards high volume, high margin, mass construction housing, and that is what we are getting. But the question about what they're doing in the Cotswolds that stops that from happening is very much a political question, but it's also a question of getting planners.
I don't know.
But the people who need the houses, who haven't got the houses, are not going to be working from home on their computer, are they?
No.
They're going to be working in a warehouse, in a McDonald's, in a pub if it doesn't go bust.
And it's false economy by the council. Because if you're not building social housing, you're paying higher benefits into the private landlord sector. It's just false economy.
Please speak. Hand waving person.
Yes,
Hi.
do you know, does anyone else know, how many planning officers we have in the county?
I know there's a 6-month delay for getting pre-planning approval. I say there can't be enough, is the answer.
So it's probably, I don't know, less than 15, but they've had 7 or 8 brought in as a kind of temporary team, because their backlog was, I think, 400 applications hadn't been determined, and they've got that right down to, when I went to the business summit last week, I think it was 70 something. So they're a team of kind of ex-planning officers and ex-head of planning have come in, and they've gone through that pile of things on the desk and tried to work it through. Because again, if you're a planning officer and you've got this forever long pile, it's actually really hard, isn't it, to ever get to the end of that when you've got applications still coming in, and then pre-apps is a whole other ballgame. Yes, not unusual to wait 6 months for a pre-app, possibly a year. I know people have got them in for like 2 or 3 years. So yeah, planning is but I suppose if you're trying to work through things, then it's really hard to be creative about your job, isn't it? So I know when I've got loads of admin or council consultation documents to fill in, I don't get to do the nice stuff about what kind of apple trees would look better on that. You know, those are the things that get put to the side. So I think there are really good planning officers in Hereford, though. I think that's worth stressing, that it's not broken. It needs a reset, and then hopefully it can fly. But I'm really keen that we don't push a pendulum in the wrong direction as a reaction to something that happened, because often the middle space is where the good stuff happens.
So if we are going to have, to be really sensible about it, if we are going to be building houses at a sensible rate, regardless of the size, but hopefully some will take that into consideration, how many planning officers should we have?
I think that's for the planning office to kind of answer for you.
When
I
he
know
turns
that
up, we can ask her.
they did do they had a peer review, which they consulted with a few kind of users of the service, and the interesting thing about that was that, say there were 4 of us doing small schemes for local people kind of thing, and there was one big developer who worked for, I forget who it was, one of the big kind of companies.
Yeah.
Now the 4 of us said how much trouble we had and how difficult it was, and you couldn't get hold of anybody, and you know the decisions were always seemed like kind of negatively framed.
Yeah.
The guy who had the big schemes,
Yeah.
he was like, oh no, I just phone up and I get the call. And
Yeah.
but that's because Herefordshire need to provide the housing because they are behind.
Yeah.
So if you had a scheme for 500, why would you deal with Mary with her 5
Yeah.
in the back end of Hereford
Can't
when you need
understand.
to get those 500 through, and they would deliver over 100 affordable houses? So I can see why they would prioritise
Yeah.
big schemes, but then if we can make big schemes better, there's room in the market for both affordable housing, self and custom build, and the major developers. So we could do a bit of each, because I know that the kind of answer about having social housing for everybody is right, but the market shows that you need all different kinds of housing to meet the market as it's strategised now.
But
So you need all of them.
social housing is not even being considered
No.
in some building plots.
No.
It's all affordable housing. Now, affordable housing is not affordable for a lot of the youngsters in Hereford,
Yeah.
and
So-
it's not affordable for a lot of the working families.
So Herefordshire
It's
Council have
now
committed.
60% of working poor people are now in existence.
So it's okay
how
because
do
Joe
they-
has just said there's going to be an explosion of council house building because there's an election next week.
So Herefordshire Council have committed to building 2,000 council houses. So Herefordshire Council have said they're going to deliver these council houses, and then I know that there are active housing associations. I mean, I was saying to the lady next to me that I think housing associations could have built more. So they are funded to do that, and planning policy in Herefordshire has always been kind of geared to that delivery market. But, you know, the land is probably the biggest problem. I'm not sure, I'd have to check with the housing providers. But there is space in the market for everybody.
What about the empty property scheme? Have we got anything like that going in Hereford?
Yes. Oh yeah, there is, yeah. So there's about 7,000, from the stats I could find today, there's about 7,000 units that are either second homes or empty homes. And I think the empty homes is in the kind of low hundreds, so not that many. But there is a scheme, and you also get double your council tax if you've got an empty property and you haven't got anybody living in it, then you get double your council tax. So they are trying to get those out, but they're not big enough. I wouldn't say they're going to be a game changer. There's not enough of them.
No, but the second homes is
second-
much greater, and that's where Cornwall have decided to
Yes,
massively increase council tax on people who own second homes in those areas.
and in Wales they have
And
as well.
and put that money into. The issue we have with social housing is the right to buy. And this is where Herefordshire Council needs to be really careful, because after 8 years you're going to have the right to buy, and everyone is either going to buy that house and take it out for perpetuity. So it's about having things like community land trusts where those houses remain in perpetuity, and splitting out the social housing element from the actual ownership of the land. And that's where we have to be really careful. We don't just build great social housing that in a few years gets turned into private housing that is then repeat sold. For
That's
multiple-
very rare. The
Affordable
loss
housing
the loss of
available to
social housing, affordable housing, was only really experienced when the council houses were sold. Now the kind of in perpetuity clauses are really, really restrictive. So I build affordable self builds in other areas where they've got an actual policy, and it's a 60% discount. Not you know, it's huge, and governed by your local wages and restricted to a local occupancy as well. So they are really, really tight.
But that's what has to happen. And you're talking about affordability. 80%, a unit of 250,000 is not affordable because they won't get a mortgage. There is a big increase in either micro homes, and that's a real problem because you're essentially saying people have to afford to live in smaller properties, or truly affordable rentals in particular, which are 40%. Now, achieving a 40% market rate is really difficult, but that has to be subsidised in some way. But if that was on increasing the council tax on second homes, that's the way in which that you do that.
You mentioned the right to buy. I looked up the figures this afternoon, and since right to buy started, and we have to remember that, particularly in the early days, it was done at a huge discount. And I remember in the 1980s, the then Labour housing chairman of Herefordshire District Council had to deal with somebody who was trying to purchase their grandmother's council house from America, but 2.5 million properties have been sold. So we've gone from somewhere around 6.5 million council houses to 2 million now. The housing association houses have risen during that time, but they haven't compensated for that shortfall. And of course those tenants enjoyed relatively reasonable rents, security of tenure, and in many cases, certainly in Hereford District Council, they're good landlords. But now, those same people or their children or grandchildren are still renters, but they are private renters, often of the same houses that were sold, because 40% of those sold properties are now in the hands of private landlords. So I know Herefordshire Council, locally, there's only a limited amount we can do to address those problems, but if and when there's a change of government, it's going to be really important, in my opinion, that we build social homes and not just rely on housing associations, that we end the subsidies that are taking place for home ownership that I mentioned earlier, and obviously we end the right to buy to discount. But that's not really, I mean, that's a national focus at the moment. Herefordshire Council got to find ways that they can work within the system we've got. For much of the time since Right to Buy came in, and I criticised my own government for that, before Gordon Brown came in, it was actually quite difficult for local authorities to invest in council housing. In fact, it was almost impossible in the early days under the 1980s, 1990s Tory government.
But there always was a right to buy. My parents could have bought their council house anytime between the 40s and the 60s, but you bought at the cost of replacement. You did not get a stonking great discount.
But this is where Thatcher failed.
She didn't want to get rid of council house.
Well, she thought council houses bred Labour voters. Actually, I must admit, that's one of thought about this over the years, and it's an element of truth in that. But
Guys, I'm just conscious of moving on because I'm going to come over from Cliff to talk about air source heat pumps and whatever else. So I thought was also interesting to look at. It's a good link to what's being said. Mary, thank you so much. It was, you know, it's, well, and all the wonderful pictures. It's just being inspired by, if we are going to build what we're going to build, in whatever social affordable, let's build best. Let's build, you know, something which, you know, is better for kind of the environment, for people that live in them, and let's not just put up stuff which isn't, you know, pretty, I guess, in lots of ways, but isn't healthy as well. So I think that's where we need to do what we're doing now, which is to listen to all different opinions and try and find that common ground, which is a perfect metaphor, I think.
And when do we start looking at community buildings being built as energy efficient places which produce energy? Because community buildings, schools can be built with specialist windows, specialist heating systems that actually generate their own energy and will heat whole communities. When are we going to move with the times?
So there are some schools in Herefordshire that are like that, but also you have to remember new schools are often paid for by big developments. So you can't kind of ask for not to have one thing but you want the other, because unless you change how the model works, the new school is paid for by those 400 homes that were provided. As a nice link to an air source heat pump, here's an affordable self-build built in our neighbouring county of Shropshire for a lady who's 83, had a triple bypass, completely carbon positive. It's got an air source heat pump. She's happy as Larry. She's a really lovely lady. And the picture's just got a little air source heat pump there, which leads me on to the next speaker.
Mary, can I just ask how much, when you say affordable, that one that you've just been describing, how much was that?
So the problem with this is she already owned the plot, so it's in her own garden.
Okay.
And I think the build cost with everything, all the renewables and everything, is probably just over 200,000.
Okay.
But she has a condition on that Heather can't sell it to anybody other than somebody that lives in the local area that's on a housing needs list for 60% discount. So she has basically freed up her family home for another family to live in. This is under their self-build policy. My colleague that I work very closely with has done the same with her family. I mean, we think that one was the first one to be extended because these have to be under 100 square metres as well. So they've got loads of restrictions on them, which I'm confident the perpetuity angle will be covered. Now, Hannah and Theo, who built one in Richard's Castle, which is half Hereford, half Shropshire, they had 2 children afterwards. And then when we all had to work from home, they both worked with me, so I needed them both to work from home. But 100 square metres is not big enough to have that. They've got a ground source heat pump, which takes up almost all of their utility room. So we did actually go to Shropshire and ask for them to have an extension so they could both work from home.
You didn't put a demand for office into their garden?
We could have done that, but I think Herefordshire, because, Shropshire, because of the way that the policy works, you can't build out of certain parts of the plots. So it's kind of their garden, if you like, although its garden is not developable. But Theo designs pods for us, so he would have been happy for that. And also, it's away from the kids, isn't it? So that means it's a lot.
And that policy thing that means they can only sell to certain. Who was that put in by? By herself or by the council?
So the council put that in. So it's actually like a set agreement. I think it would have been under Section 106, but it might be under a unilateral undertaking. But it's kind of covenanted through law, and they're really, really hard to get out of. So even if right to buy became a thing, the self-build properties are almost excluded. Well, they are definitely excluded from that as well, which is, in one sense, is trapping people in a house that they probably can't sell very easily. But if they built it because they want to live there and that's their area, they might not want to sell anyway.
Okay. So this is how it's going to work. Ben's going to talk, and he'll show you who he is in a second when it's worked. And then Nikki's going to do a bit, if that's okay, Nikki, from Connexus.
I haven't got anything planned. I was just going to say when I work really. And,
okay. Well, that would be good because if we go from Ben first, because that kind of links into the, and then we do you from the Connexus, and then Ellie's turned up to talk from the council. Nick, you said please, please, and there's a kind of donation thing to throw in a few quid for yeah, you go for it. And so why isn't this work? Have a banana and a slice of cake. Please. Why is it not? I'm definitely eat it now. So, they said earlier, but I zoned out in here, but it looks really nice. Just go through it. How are you? All right? Thank you. I'm brilliant. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I didn't really do that. Okay, yeah, so, Ben, he's going to talk. Whilst I warned Ben that we have a few people in the room who know a fair bit about source heat pumps, and some of you don't, so Ben's going to do a brilliant thing under my guidance, which is to talk for a bit, and then if you have a question, just chip in and ask him about it, because he knows a lot. This is a very truncated 15, 20 minutes talk, which I've seen Ben do for about an hour and a bit. Okay.
Sorry, quick show of hands then. Who thinks they know stuff about heat pumps already?
Yeah, that's the way to do it. We teach you that.
Bits and pieces.
Bits.
Okay. So to introduce myself, my name's Ben Whittle. I live in Herefordshire, just up the road from Joe, who isn't in
So you're only
Herefordshire.
just in there?
Yeah, I'm in Clifford, about 2 miles away.
No, he's not close.
Just about, just
Yeah.
about.
Oh, it's much further to Herefordshire than Jeff.
So I actually started off my career in renewables about 20 years ago, and I ran an installation business in Herefordshire for about 6 years called Southern Solar. We were based in Leicester, and we were one office of 6 or 7 that spanned quite a large area of the country. So yeah, 15 years in experience in renewables, actually installing this stuff. And my job has usually been about, I started off actually doing installations, but then I sort of rose up the tree a little bit and managed installations. And then I became a sort of training manager for people coming into the company, so they understood what they were doing when they were installing it, making sure that they did high quality work that met all the regulations and so on. But after that, I hung up my shoes, having worked in solar hot water, solar electric, biomass and heat pump installation work. And then I went to work for the Energy Saving Trust. So now I'm an analyst at the Energy Saving Trust, and nearly all of my time is spent writing about or communicating about heating technologies, because that's my specialty. And I think it's fair to say that nearly anybody in the room who thinks they know about heat pumps, if they've read about it in newspapers, they've probably got pretty bad information. It doesn't matter what your political persuasion is, what red top or blue top newspaper you're reading, they all regularly write stuff that is wildly inaccurate, and it drives me absolutely mad. So I'm
Journalists never do that, Ben. Journalists don't do that. Sorry. We shouldn't expect journalists to necessarily understand all of this stuff, but it's amazing how frequently things get printed which are not accurate. So I basically did a presentation which Joe saw to try and dispel some of those myths, because I'd seen so much of it going on in the press over the course of the last year. And this is a very sort of short version of that presentation. So during the course of this, I'm going to talk an awful lot about kilowatt hours, and I don't want to assume that you all necessarily know what kilowatt hour is. A kilowatt hour is 1 unit of electricity. A kilowatt hour could be heat, it could be electricity. So to give you a little bit of context, over the course of a year, the average house uses around about 3,500 kilowatt hours of electricity, but about 4 times more than that in energy. So the average house, when I say average, we're talking about a 3-bed semi on gas. They would be using about 13,000 kilowatt hours of heat. So quite a lot more heat is used in the building than electricity. This graphic here is showing you what the emissions are for the whole of the UK. Can we read forward a second? Do you guys want to move over here? I'm conscious that we put it there, and I feel you don't have to move, but I'm saying if you want to move, you want to see it better. Eddie, and sec with the finger front.
So that graphic there is all the carbon dioxide emissions the UK is responsible over the course of the year. And if you look at the different colour sections, pink is buildings, that could be commercial buildings or domestic buildings. Orange is transport, green is industry, and blue is agriculture. And if you look at the fan a little bit closer, I appreciate that's probably quite small for you to read. Basically what it's saying there is about 17% of all carbon dioxide emissions in the UK are heat for homes. It's pretty substantial. So it's really important that we have a go at tackling this. Now, of course, we've been decarbonising electricity very successfully over the course of the last 20 years or so. The one thing we haven't tackled is heat. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'm going to start off talking about the carbon dioxide emissions associated with electricity, which is a far smaller part of what we use in a house. But of course, crucially, when you're talking about heat pumps, electricity is what you use to drive the heat pump. So this graph here now is showing you what the carbon dioxide emissions are for making electricity in the UK. And on the left-hand side of the graph, we're starting off in 1985, and on the right-hand side of the graph, we're moving along to 2020. And you can see that the shape of that graph there as it goes up, that's us using more and more electricity. But since around about 2005, our electricity use has actually gone down. That's a result of more energy efficient lighting and more energy efficient products that we use in our homes. So our electricity use is going down, but of course we expect it to go back up again with the electrification of heat and with electrification of transport. Now the black section you can see on there, that's coal. It's pretty much the dirtiest source of energy you could use to generate electricity. But as you can see, one of the reasons we've become more successful at reducing our carbon dioxide emissions is because there is literally practically no coal whatsoever left in our electricity mix now. The much larger area there, you can see a dark grey in the middle, that is gas. The lighter grey below that is nuclear. And then all of the blue colours there are the renewables. And there's a little extra green stripe at the bottom there for renewables. So you can see there was virtually no renewable energy being produced. It just started ticking up from around about the year 2000, and then it massively ramped up from 2010 through to 2020 with the introduction of the various schemes under the government from the feed-in tariff to incentivise solar and wind energy. Now the next slide is overlaid over the top of it. It's exactly the same graphic, but there's a red line on there, and it's showing you where our carbon dioxide emissions started and how they've dropped over that period. So in the top left there, really high carbon dioxide emissions because there was so much coal, and then as that mix changed over time, we've dropped down to around about 250 grams of carbon dioxide for each unit of electricity that we generate now. You can also see at the bottom there, there's another red line marked 2030 target. That's what UK government has suggested we should be aiming for. And you know, looking at that trajectory of the line, be reasonable to assume that we can potentially get there. But we've addressed a lot of the low-hanging fruit. We still need to go out there and put in more solar and wind if we're going to do that. Or nuclear. There may be some very mixed emotions in the room about nuclear and whether or not that's a good idea. The one thing we can say about nuclear with confidence is whatever your feelings are about the dirtiness of it and the sustainability of it, it does produce really, really low carbon electricity. It's probably the lowest carbon form of electricity you can get, and that's even compared to solar or wind. It is astonishingly low, but of course it's got all the other baggage that goes around with that as well. Now, that looks like a pretty good picture. It is a really good picture for electricity decarbonisation. If you look at Norway, for the last 40 years, that big blue section there is hydro. About 90% of their electricity is hydro, and it's been like that for 40 years. What are the implications for so much hydro on their system? Well, if we compared the UK, Norway and USA to each other, Norway's got the cleanest system on the far left. The UK, with our current mix of all the things that I showed you previously, we've got 23 times more carbon produced for each unit of electricity in the UK. The United States of America has still got loads of coal generation, and they're 55 times higher than the US, than Norway. So not only do Americans tend to use more electricity than any other nation in the world, it's also really dirty electricity, and that's why their carbon dioxide emissions is so high, like really, really badly high.
How much of Norway's hydro is wave generated compared to traditional sort of gravity turbine, hydroelectric from glaciers?
I don't actually know the answer to that question, but my feeling is that it's probably very small, because there are very few nations anywhere in the world that are doing anything with tidal, to be honest. It's nearly all gravity.
And do we have some capability for increasing our hydro, or is it just Scotland?
There's plenty of untapped resource, but the reason it's untapped is because of the cost of doing it. And it depends a little bit on what scale you're talking about. So there's plenty of small streams in Wales that could be utilised more than they are, but because they're in rural areas with a very weak grid in that area, it costs money to reinforce the connection and get it connected to the grid, and therefore it doesn't happen.
So that was one of the questions we had earlier about micro generation of why could have Archimedes screw, you know, turbines generating at least power for those homes. Have we got scope in Herefordshire for much more? I mean, I know Marches Energy have done some stuff in Clevebury around micro turbines and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the economic situation around putting in hydro is utterly dependent on government subsidy.
Right.
If you looked at the raw numbers without any subsidy whatsoever, it just doesn't stack up.
Yeah.
There will come a time, if energy prices keep on going up in the way that they have done, where that calculation might change, but right now it's not that different than it was 5 years ago.
Sorry, haven't we always subsidised electricity production? Like subsidising coal, subsidising oil? Haven't we been doing it for decades?
I accept your point.
Sorry.
You know, fossil fuels get subsidies as well.
Yeah.
And that's an often misunderstood subject too. So across the whole world.
Well, I just find that outrageous. But
Yeah, I totally agree. It is absolutely outrageous. There's about 6 times more subsidy going to fossil fuels than there is renewable energy.
then they tell us we can't afford renewables.
Yes, it's ridiculous. So I've talked about electricity so far. I'm going to move on to heat now. That black dotted line now that you're seeing for electric heat, that's basically the emissions curve that I've already showed you, that from 1985 through to now, going down. If that was just direct electricity, so going into electric underfloor heating, an electric boiler, or electric radiators, that is how much carbon in 2020, you can see it's just hitting around about 250. That line has basically met the gas boiler, which is the big grey section there. So there's 2 stripes of grey there. The lighter grey is what would happen if you burnt gas with 100% efficiency. We don't do that. There's about 15% efficiency loss in most boilers. And that little extra slice on top, the darker grey, is what that 15% energy loss is. And you can see now electricity, historically, is just as green to deliver heat as burning gases. And it's the first time that's ever happened in UK history. So that's a bit of a groundbreaker. But then underneath this, we can see the pink line. Now, because a heat pump delivers 3 times more heat for every unit of electricity you put into it, therefore the carbon dioxide emissions of producing heat with a heat pump are 1/3 of whatever it is for electricity. And that's what that pink line is showing you there. It's exactly the same shape as the dark black line, but it's just the numbers are a third of that amount. So since 1990, heat pumps have been greener than gas boilers. And if we look at the figures now, they're basically about 70% greener than gas boilers. So there's a massive imperative there. 90% of houses on the UK, across the UK, are on gas. And we could save 75% of the carbon that they emit by everybody switching to heat pumps. But of course we've got this problem that the narrative in the press is, well, heat pumps only work in well-insulated houses, they're noisy, they're expensive. And so those are the kind of myths that I regularly have to dispel.
Isn't it also a case that if you had to have a new boiler, gas boiler put in, it'd probably be about £3,500? But actually if you have a heat pump put in, it's twice that?
It could be worse than that. It could be even more. And so that statement, you're going to have to decide whether or not you're going to include the subsidy that the grant that the government will give you. So there's a scheme that launched about a week ago, which rather than paying you for how much heat you used in your home, which is what the old scheme was, they just give you a lump sum, which is a great change. I don't think it's a generous enough offer. So the new scheme will offer you £5,000 for an air source heat pump, whereas previously they would have offered you around about £1,000 a year, £1,200 a year, spread it every year for 7 years. So you'd end up getting about £8,000 or £9,000, but spread out over 7 years. Now they'll just give you a lump sum, £5,000 up front. Because they're so expensive to put in, it's great that they're front-loading it and putting it all in a lump sum, but it's not as attractive as the old scheme. And I would argue that maybe it should be better placed at around about £7,500 or £8,000. Because really you want people to look at replacing the gas boiler and say, well, it's not going to cost me any more to do than putting in a gas boiler. That's where we should be really, but that's not where we're at.
Because we're a rural county, outside the city, centres of population, a lot of us don't have gas in the first place, so we're using oil or such like. And we won't want to comment on this. The government seem to be talking about stopping fossil fuels usage in rural areas before they're tackling the mains.
I don't think that's necessarily a fair characterisation. So what we've got coming up policy-wise is in 2025 a ban on new gas boilers. So new builds, Mary, still here? There you go. New builds won't be able to have a gas boiler. There's obviously the separate issue then, what do you do with replacement boilers? Will you still be able to buy a gas boiler after 2025? Well, yes, you will. Nobody is going to sort of rip the boiler out of your cold dead hands as you protest. That's not going to happen. With people who are off the gas grid, on oil or LPG or whatever other form of heating, the idea is that you would not be able to replace past 2030. So there's a sort of 6 or 7 policy lead in time where they've set a marker. Unfortunately, what they haven't done is say this is very much a hard stop. This is definitely going to happen. At the moment, it's a policy ambition, not a law or regulation or anything like that. And this is a scheme that's worked very well in Norway, was to set a target and set a ratcheting form of assistance. So they started off saying, right, in 5 years we're going to ban all fossil fuels in homes. Simple as that, we're just going to do it. And we're going to give you this much assistance in year 1 now, in this 5-year run up. There's going to be a decreasing amount of assistance in year 2 and decreasing again in year 3. That really focuses the mind. And they've achieved a situation now where there is no more fossil fuel use in Norway. None at all in houses for heating. So it's a great tool. The next slide I'm going to show you is where we will be in 2030 if we meet that target that I showed you on the earlier slide. And here we go. That's the difference in carbon dioxide emissions for heating a house in 2020 versus 2030. And you can see there's a 90% difference now between a gas boiler and a heat pump. So that's what we're aiming for, and that's why it's so important that we do take this idea about moving towards electrification of heat so seriously, because that's what we could be doing, reducing 90% of the emissions associated with heating most houses in the country. Even more if you're on oil or LPG. The figures are even worse than gas. It reduces another 10 or 20% more carbon dioxide than gas. So that the argument is equally compelling for rural homes as well. This is a breakdown showing you how much energy is used in the home for heat. So the pink sections are heating and hot water. As you can see, that adds up to about 80% of the energy used in the house. And the rest of it is all basically electrical use. So that's cooking, lighting, fridge freezers, consumer electronics, and so on. Because of the disparity in prices between gas and electricity, although we can save all this carbon with heat pumps, what we can't say categorically is, will it save me money if I put it in? Which is obviously a massive issue in the situation we're in at the moment with fuel poverty. But things have changed. Again, some ground has been broken in the last month, and that happened with the price caps. So what governs whether a heat pump will run more cheaply or more expensively than a gas boiler is the ratio in prices between gas and electricity. Gas is roughly, or was previously, about 4 times more expensive, 4 times cheaper than electricity. So to get a heat pump to run as cheaply as a gas boiler, it meant you had to have an efficiency of 4 to 1 for a heat pump, which is practically unachievable. It is achievable, but not in your average house by the average person running from how most people run them. But now that ratio under the new price caps in April changed to be much closer to 3 to 1. So now we can actually say, I'll see if I can find the right slide for you, hang on a sec. This basically shows you the variability in cost of running houses under different pricing scenarios. The red dots show you what we as the Energy Saving Trust know to be the typical price for that particular fuel source. Now, why is there a variability in the price at all? Well, with a heat pump, the variability in running cost is over the course of the year, and depending on how efficiently you can get that heat pump to run. But that red spot on there is showing you what the typical house would run at over the course of the whole year. For a gas boiler, there's a much smaller variation there, and that variation is how efficient is my boiler. Now, boilers tend to operate between 82 and 92% efficient. Lots of boiler manufacturers will tell you, well, I'm selling you this condensing boiler, they're fantastically efficient, they can do 94%. The only way you can achieve that efficiency is by running the boiler set up as efficiently as possible, which means running it as low a temperature as possible. And there's a dial on the front of nearly every one of your boilers for your radiators. You can move it left and right, and it's always set bang in the middle. And unless you turn it down as low as it can possibly go, it will not go into condensing mode, and that efficiency boost that boiler manufacturers tell you is available just won't be realised. So we know at the Energy Saving Trust, because we did a case study on it, looking at around about 80 houses, I think it was, that when we actually measured their efficiency, they were typically running about 2 or 3% more efficient than one of the older boilers from the 1980s, because most people just hadn't ever been told about that dial and how to set it and what benefits there were to them by making the effort to change that dial throughout the course of the year to get it running as efficiently as possible. So oil and LPG, the next line along, the variation there is in the price of oil or LPG throughout the course of the year. I'm sure anybody here who's out in the sticks will know that you can go and get an oil delivery delivered to your house in 2 days' time in June when nobody's thinking about it, and you can buy your oil at 45 pence. I was in that situation 3 years ago myself before I installed a heat pump at my house. And then it comes to December, and magically the prices have gone up to 65%, and it takes you 3 weeks to get a delivery. So that long line there is showing you the variation over the course of the whole year. Typically speaking, we expect oil to be, well, historically, an average of around about 50 pence a litre over the course of the year. When Ukraine got invaded, it spiked up to £1.50 a litre. It's dropped down now to about £1.20 a litre. But if you want to beat a heat pump in terms of running costs for an oil boiler, you need to be buying at less than 75 pence a litre. And I cannot see that situation coming around again for a very long time, if ever. But oil and LPG are not regulated markets. Gas and electricity are regulated, so we have these price caps. As long as you stay on a variable tariff, your energy prices won't go more than 28 pence a kilowatt hour for electricity, or 7.5 pence for gas right now. But just to go back to another slide we've got, and I can't find it now, we do not know exactly where these gas prices, electricity prices are going to end up in October. So currently, if you added the gas and the electricity bill together, the average house used to pay around about £1,300 a year.
So with the energy cap, that is a subsidy. Who pays for anything above that?
The energy suppliers are the ones that are actually paying for it in some ways. So this is the reason why so many energy suppliers have gone bust in the last 3 months. I think I might have a slide on it here.
So it would be in the energy supplier's interest to switch people from gas and oil boilers to heat pumps, because that de-risks them only being able to charge what is
No,
price.
No,
unfortunately not.
because the energy suppliers are asking for a subsidy to be paid to social people, which is from the government's pocket, which means that then they won't, if they were to be given that money, it would be a subsidy really to the energy company.
At the moment, there's a wholesale market out there, and there's a profit margin added on top, and then there's you end up with a selling price. So what the government does is every 6-month period, it looks at the wholesale market, and it looks at the consumer price index, and it basically comes up with a calculation. It's not that complicated a calculation. You can actually go and download a spreadsheet if you want off the BEIS website to find out what that calculation is. But they basically end up saying to the energy suppliers, we know what the market's doing, and we're not going to let you sell electricity or gas for more than this much over this 6-month period. And then they redo that calculation every 6 months. The wholesale markets have been relatively steady, and then went absolutely bonkers over the last year. And there were a number of reasons why that happened. It wasn't just about Ukraine. All of this change was happening long before Ukraine happened. It's to do with supply and demand in markets all over the world, pressure in China, the fact that we don't store as much gas in this country as we used to, so we've got less of a buffer from that market. But the end result is that when the market changes upwards very quickly, the wholesale price goes up very quickly. There's a ceiling at which the supplier is not allowed to charge more, but the wholesale price has gone up and past that ceiling. And so suddenly they're losing money until hopefully the price cap goes up again for them, so they can start making some profit margin again. But basically they're getting squeezed up against this hard ceiling where they're not allowed to charge more money, but the cost of buying electricity is getting higher and higher, and their fixed overheads for running the system are staying where they are, they're not allowed to pass those costs on. It's basically done through the standing charge rather than through the variable rate of your electricity bill. And so basically their profit margin was completely disappearing, and that's why we saw all these companies go bust. Now, moving into the new price cap, the standing charge has increased, and the reason it's gone up is to subsidise the cost of all of those suppliers that are having to take on all of that debt from the companies that went out of business.
But surely part of the problem is the nature of the market. If you take a natural monopoly, artificially create some sort of Mickey Mouse market structure, then sooner or later it goes pear-shaped. You've got an industry which we used to run perfectly adequately in the national interest as a nationalised industry, which is what it ought to be now. If you can try to control it, you might as well own it.
I'm sitting here giving you a presentation with my Energy Saving Trust hat on and an Energy Saving Trust logo in the corner, and I could not possibly say something. I couldn't say something so political with that hat on. Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, I think there's a good case for nationalising energy. Yeah.
But in terms of local electricity generation, I mean, certainly communities can generate their own. I mean, the onshore wind issue is going to be a trade-off, isn't it? Whether people will be happier to have lower energy bills and essentially accept the fact that there may need to be more onshore wind or nuclear or alternative ways of generating.
We have biomass in Herefordshire.
Yeah. So
biomass is I guess it's either wood burning is not great, is it?
That's like a slide about biomass.
Biomass.
You love the anti-biomass thing.
I do, yeah.
I'm just conscious of time because so do the biomass thing, and then any other questions, Ben? I want Nikki to do a few words about social housing, and then we can have Ellie.
Sure. So just to speak to your point there, at the moment, about 2.5% of the gas bill is environmental tax, and about 25% of the electricity bill is environmental tax. And you quite often hear people complaining about these environmental taxes, making their bills higher. We've now moved into a situation where loads of people are finding themselves in fuel poverty, which wasn't the case 2 months ago. And they're suddenly realising that the support schemes they can access, like winter fuel payments and so on, warm home discounts, that's where it comes from. It's also helping to pay for insulation programmes for people on benefits. Those taxes are there for a reason. They're not necessarily put on the bill in the most sensible or logical way. And in fact, it penalises the move to heat pumps. Because 25% of the environmental tax of the bill is on electricity, it would make much more sense for that 25% levy to go across to the gas bill, which would make the end amount of levy that we collect across the country is around about £4 billion a year. It doesn't matter whether it comes on the gas bill or the electricity bill, but the way it's set up at the moment is actually discouraging people from moving across to heat pumps. And if we could move it across to gas instead, which after all is 90% of the population, it's a slightly more fair way of doing it in some ways, who are creating much more pollution, that would be an extra boost towards moving the people across to heat pumps. There is talk about doing that, by the way. That is a policy ambition, that levies will be moved across from electricity and onto gas. Arguably, it should also be some sort of levy on oil and LPG as well, because they're also highly polluting fuels, but they're not regulated, so that's a much more politically difficult situation to manage. But to talk to your bit about your question about biomass, when we talk about burning biomass in this country, there's always an assumption that it's really low carbon. When you burn a tree, it releases as much carbon dioxide as burning coal. It's as simple as that. If not, it's even worse, because it's not as energy dense, it takes more energy to move it around, and it also, they've got a very similar problem with particulate pollution as well. But what you're seeing here is the amount of carbon in each unit of different types of fuel, all in a line next to each other. So we've got electricity on the left, oil, LPG, butane, propane, and then seasoned wood and pellets. When we talk about it in policy terms, really, really low, jump back up again for smokeless fuel, coal, and then right at the end we've got ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. And as you can see, they're approaching the low levels that we see for biomass, but not quite as low. Also, hiding on the left there, we've got two horrible bars hiding behind the tree. that's what wood looks like if you add it. The reason there's a difference there, those bars are basically showing you how much gets released when it's burnt. When the bars aren't there, what you're seeing, the smaller amounts, that's what it takes to process it and move it around. So we just don't count the bit that's released when it's burnt, because the argument being we can replace it by growing more trees. But the reality is, if you want low carbon heating, you'd be far better off leaving the trees standing and putting in ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps.
Except young trees suck in a hell of a lot more carbon than established trees when they're growing. If you're cutting down, if you're coppicing your wood to go on your wood burner and not moving it halfway around the country, and definitely not putting it in a kiln to dry it using energy.
Don't get me started on that.
It is quite efficient if you're using waste wood in situ.
A lot of the wood that's getting burned in poultry farms around
Oh,
Herefordshire.
a lot of it isn't waste wood used in situ, of course, but the problem is the commercial aspect of flogging wood and wood burners, not the burning of wood on wood burners per se.
If you're
Used
buying
appropriately, it's quite low.
if you're buying kiln drying wood in Herefordshire, there's a massive chance that somebody else burnt some more wood to dry it out in the first
Oh yeah,
place.
absolutely.
And then
Right.
somebody got some benefit, some heat incentive off the first burning of the wood and the second burning of the wood, and doubled the amount of pollution that went along with
Yeah.
it all at the same time. It's a policy disaster.
That's not housing, that's another industry you mentioned before.
But if you're maintaining coppice and put it in a shed for 3 years before you burn it,
Yeah,
it's a different kettle of
yeah, and
fish.
there is wood that's just going to lie on the ground and rot, and
You release, if it rots on the
Rots
ground,
anyway,
it
yeah.
releases carbon.
it's complicated. But there's also the other issues that go along with it around particulate pollution. And out of there's about 40,000 deaths a year in the UK from air pollution. Roughly 15,000 of them are produced by burning wood.
Largely in dense populated areas, though. So with diesel particulates, if you chuck a lot of them out in a city, it's going to kill people.
Basically, more people die from wood burning than they do from traffic in terms of particulate pollution.
The interesting thing is I was able to persuade clients to have air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps without any bother like 10 years ago. Nobody even thought it was a bad thing. But to lose a wood burner or not have a wood burner is all, I just can't get people not to say that that's part of their kind of top wish list of what they might have.
Yeah,
It's interesting, even though they know that it has particulate matter and that it's not necessarily carbon
It looks
neutral.
pretty, though. It just looks pretty.
I think it's people's
I've got
psychology of
one.
homes.
Yeah.
So I've got one and I use it twice.
Yeah.
Almost a waste of money. But
I've got one at home, and I do use it. I don't want to claim like I'm a complete saint in this
Yeah.
area, but it's a constant source of conversation in our
Yeah.
house because my wife, farmer's daughter, she's lived with wood burning all her life. She absolutely loves wood burning. We just try to keep it to the weekends. We have it when it's cold and a weekend only, and that's the rule. We try to stick to that.
Any last minute questions about air
Yeah.
source? There's
Any
lots of
questions about how they work, economics, anything?
The air source and the ground source?
Yeah.
Is there any particular difference in the way they can be used? Can they be put into the floor more easily, or is there a difference in the way they behave in the house?
It's often been said that ground source heat pumps are more efficient than air source heat pumps. I get to see quite a lot of data about heat pumps and how they perform. It is definitely true that ground source heat pumps tend to perform better than air source heat pumps, but there is a massive price premium that goes along with that as well. So the average air source heat installation at the moment in the UK for a smallish house would be probably about £10,000. A ground source heat pump installation, you'd be lucky to get much change out of 25 grand. It can be done for less than that. If you go to certain companies like Kansa, you probably come across.
32,000 I've just been quoted from ground source heat
Yeah,
pumps.
so there you go. So there you've spent an extra £20,000 to save yourself £200 a year in running costs. That's an awful lot of money to make back.
And how long do they last? How long do the pumps expected to last?
So we always end up going back to car analogies, don't we? If you buy a decent car and the radiator goes in a crash and it's going to cost you £2 grand to sort it out, it's a small percentage of the overall cost, and you're more than happy to replace the radiator and keep it going on the road. If you've got a cheap Ford Fiesta and you have the same ding, and that represents half the cost of the house of the car, you're much more likely to just say, "Sod it, I'll get another heat pump." So if you invest in high quality equipment, it's much more likely to last for a long time. I've got pictures I can show you of heat pumps that have been in operation for 35 years or more because of that ongoing approach to maintenance. But if you buy a cheap heat pump and have it installed badly and controlled it badly, the lifespan is not going to be really that different to a gas boiler.
What is that price differential between what you might define as a cheap air source pump and a premium, higher quality air source pump?
Probably double.
Okay, so it's quite substantial.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about double the installation cost. I'm
No,
talking
just
double the heat pumping cost. So if you went to a wholesaler and tried to buy a small heat pump now, you could get one for about £3.5 grand, but it would cost you 10 grand installed. A lot of people go, well, that's an insane markup. How is that possible? But so much of the work is just getting people onto site, doing the design work, the back office, the insurance, the travel, all that kind of stuff. You have to mark the equipment up to a degree. It doesn't matter whether you put a large markup on the heat pump or a large markup on the labour. Ultimately, you need to make about 3 or 4 grand profit off each job to stay in business and manage all of those maintenance issues and your advertising and all that kind of stuff. People are not getting ripped off having heat pumps installed for 10 grand. That is the cost of them. It will come down. Octopus Energy have got some really interesting stuff on the horizon. They claim to be able to get a heat pump in now for about 8 grand. And you will start seeing a lot more press about that coming up soon because I've been speaking to them a lot recently. Sorry, I've seen your hand go up a lot.
I just wonder if you could say something about the size of units, because in the village where I live, the Housing Association offered the council tenants the offer of heat pumps if they wanted them, and I know a couple who've got one, basically an old people's bungalow, and they've got a box on the front of the house. But the community centre have also got a heat source pump, air source pump, and I mean it's a much bigger building, but what they've got installed seems enormous. And I don't know why.
So if you were to look at an air source heat pump, Mary showed you some slides earlier, for a small house, that was a bungalow, what was it, about 70 metres squared floor area, something like that. The unit itself will be about that wide, about so tall, and about that deep. If you've got a bigger building, you're going to end up with a bigger heat pump. Ground source heat pumps don't have anything outside the building. All there is something on the inside of the building about the size of an American-style fridge, and everything else is hidden underground. It's only the air source heat pumps that have got this very visible block outside. I've got is a 14 kilowatt heat pump, so it's probably at least double the size of the one you saw in Mary's slide, and it's basically 2 of those units stacked on top of each other. So it ends up being about so tall, and about so wide, and about so deep.
That's outside, isn't it? There's also a tank inside.
Well, but a hot water cylinder, just like you have with any boiler.
It's a bit bigger, but it's...
But most people have got a hot water cylinder already, unless they're in a smaller property with a combi boiler. That's more of an issue.
You mentioned earlier a much greater price for a ground source heat pump installation, but my impression when I reviewed this was that ground source is unlikely to work for a single small building unit. That ground source is much more scalable. If you've got half a dozen properties sharing an installation,
well,
then ground source becomes... And earlier on we had mentioned, because I think that I was surprised, much earlier on before you, someone referred to a school, I thought, well, one of the things that you have with a school, as a rule, if you've got a decent school, is a certain amount of space. It tends to go with a school. So, your facility for sticking in a ground source pump if you've got a school is really, you can do it. And then, because of the sheer scale, you should be able to do that very efficiently.
In terms of what the area that you need for a ground source heat pump, this is a really rough rule of thumb. If you look at the footprint of the building, the total floor area, so let's say you've got a 50 metre square building and it's 2 floors, you've got a total floor area there of 100 metres square. You'd need about 250 metres squared of garden to manage that.
Which of course you haven't got.
You can't plant things in that space, so you can't plant a tree, for example. It's kind of designated just for the workings of that system. So you have to have quite a bit of space.
Or the alternative is, instead of using up all that large flat space, you drill boreholes. And then each borehole is going to cost about £6 grand. There's absolutely massive opportunity
Just the outlay
for most
costs.
schools.
Fairfield looked at it and he was like, oh my god, really?
Can I just ask one
Yes,
question
of
about
course you can.
noise and air source? Can you tell us current ones?
Yeah, sure. So there are rules for every air source heat pump installation. There are planning rules just under the building regulations. It's managed under a process called the Microgeneration Certification Scheme. So every installation, the installer has to come along and assess your building and whether or not it's going to be suitable. Now, nobody cares if you wake yourself up with your own heat pump. They care about you waking other people up with your heat pump. So what the rules say is that the noise level shouldn't be higher than 42 decibels at your neighbour's nearest habitable room, which could be a bedroom, a living room, a study, anything that's not a bathroom or kitchen, basically.
Is that inside the room or outside?
Outside the room, so it's measured to the window. That 42 decibel limit is what's in the regulations. There are now heat pumps being produced that will only produce about 45 decibels of noise. So you could practically put one of these heat pumps a metre away from the bedroom window and it wouldn't cause any problems. The way you get the noise levels down is by having really large diameter fans, and that means they move large volumes of air, but not necessarily so quickly. Whereas before you might have had a smaller fan moving air more quickly to get the same amount of heat through the heat exchanger system. So basically, yes, heat pumps are getting designed to be quieter and quieter all the time. If there were a heat pump operating at that wall over there, I wouldn't need to raise my voice to talk to you at all. And I can probably show you video of that on my phone afterwards if you want to see that. But you should be able to stand literally right next to a heat pump and hold a conversation with somebody right next to you.
I've just had one uninstalled, and I'll give you my verdict of it. When it's cold, it is a little bit noisy.
Yeah, so they get noisier as it gets colder.
Installation. Yeah, so they do get a bit noisy. So
But not disruption noise. If you
not
go to an
disruptive
office
noise.
and
No,
then
no.
You wouldn't hear them. And then
Yeah, I've got a slide, and I don't think we'll have time to show it, but I had something I wanted to show back on the idea, and the kind of Green Party member here as well, about onshore wind farms and the noise. It all, you know, kind of covers it really. I'm just amazed that if people had these on their homes, they wouldn't mind so much. If they could see a wind turbine that was being powered their village, I don't think they would mind that much personally. I think it's going to come at some point. I mean, and as Ben, if they can get if they make them quieter still, the better still. But they're not bad. They really are.
They get noisier when it gets colder,
Yeah.
or when they have to do the hot water part of it. But even when they work in those, when it's colder outside, they've got to do all that extra work. Even then, you should, yes, you would have to raise your voice a little bit standing next to it, but you wouldn't be shouting. You make yourself heard quite easily.
And compared to my old boiler, which is an oil boiler, trust me, it's a million times better.
I'm sometimes walk past boilers when I'm out on my dog walk in the morning, and I can. People's gas condensing boilers are actually noisier than my heat pump, but that's probably down to the installer probably choosing the duct sizes to be too small. Anyway, I'll stop there. I think you need to move.
That's a good link, because didn't you say, Nicky, earlier that all of your houses that are built have an air source heat pump? Is that right?
No, some of our rural properties,
The rural properties do.
that we improve and have built in the past. And some of the stock that we took over, they put ground source heat pumps, yeah.
Oh, right.
Simply because at the time there wasn't any gas in the village, for example, as I think the safety said. Yes, we did do something.
So, Nicky, feel free to come over if you want to. If you want to stay there, you can do.
Oh, I'll stay here.
Oh, no, you can't, because the camera's over here.
Camera.
Sorry.
And the mic.
Sorry.
It's all right.
No one watching, but it's being recorded.
Oh, that's fine.
Oh, yeah, it's been. Everyone's realised that. Oh, come on.
You're on Instagram now.
Only 2 minutes. So, my name's Nicky. I came along tonight by invitation, really, and I came because I've got a strong interest in housing, and especially in my local area. But I do happen to work for Connexus Homes, so Joe asked me just to say a few words of what we're doing at the moment. So I've made a few notes. So don't quiz me too much on the nitty-gritty of our company, because my role there is the head of governance. So we're regulated by the government, so it's my job to make sure that we do everything we're supposed to be doing from a regulatory point of view. So the nitty-gritty housing management and development, I know a little bit about. So we are the largest social housing provider in the area, as you probably already know, and we cover from Herefordshire, Shropshire. Our biggest commitment that we talk about is our commitment to our communities and our existing tenants, many of who came over from the 2 stock transfers that were popular years ago that we've already talked about already, stock transfer, and our ambition is to build around 250 new homes every year going forward. We employ almost 600 staff, so we have an ambition to be known as a good employer as well as a good landlord. We own around 11,000 homes, shops and garages. I was just going to quickly say some of our existing challenges are around improving our existing stock, so those two stock transfers that came over. We have a large asset management programme, and a lot of our money goes into, we're a not-for-profit organisation by the way, a lot of that money that we bring in from our rents go back into improving our stock and building our new homes. Some of our challenges are with the current government, so our funding isn't as available and as abundant as it used to be, so it's quite difficult to work within our budgets. Our income in rent that we're using to improve our stock is quite constrained now, and one of our biggest challenges is I always get this the wrong way round, net zero carbon agenda. So we know that in the future, to address that agenda that's set by the government, it's going to cost us millions of pounds, not hundreds of thousands, it's going to cost us millions. So that's a big challenge at the moment. And I just wanted to say that I was fascinated with on my table, two people sat on the table talking about the right to buy and the impact that's had, and also the gentleman there talking about how difficult it is for our young people to have their own home. There is that huge gap now between owning your own property and very, very high private market rents. So we do need to, my passion is we do need to provide social housing, not affordable housing, as you were saying. It's social, going back to basics, and that's what we want to do at Connexus, is provide that good quality social housing. And today, literally today, we had the opening of our Bath Street scheme. I don't know if you've seen that scheme in Hereford. We bought the old Bath Street registry office, and I went there today to see that development. There's 74 units there, all social housing. Apart from, I think there's a few at the front that we did do on a shared ownership arrangement, but in the main they're all social housing, and I was lucky enough to go into two of the properties and talk to young people, exactly the type of young people that you were describing, talking to two young families who were over the moon with their homes, and they are exactly the sort of people we want to be providing housing for. So that's what I was going to quickly say. I might be able to answer some questions, but as I say, I work behind the scenes.
Some years ago, when Hereford Housing, which I think might have been your
predecessor,
took down flats all around the Oval, there are far less social housing in that development now than there ever were before. And whatever you might say about the way those flats have been used for the sorts of people that put in them towards the end, those flats were quite generously sized, and I mean, the houses that built there, boxes of ticky-tacky little boxes.
There's 260 houses knocked down and 100 social houses put back in.
Sorry?
There's 260 flats knocked down and 100 social and affordable homes.
I can't remember the figures, but that seems. And I think possibly the same has been true along Beatty Avenue. And so I'm pleased to hear that your Bath Street development is supposedly almost all social housing, but that hasn't been the case in the past. And I know housing associations are working in difficult environments, but that's not what I imagined housing associations should be formed for when I sort of first became aware of them back in the late 70s and early 80s.
The issue I have with the social housing that you're replacing some of it with, it's very small, you're causing more social issues because there's a lack of space for the families that are living there. I mean, those flats I think you're talking about now with younger people, not necessarily families. But I know the Oval scheme, the houses are much smaller, there's hardly any garden. The green space has been taken up by building. So I think what social issues are you causing by what you're doing?
I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think the Oval scheme was quite a few years ago when we were quite constrained by the the government, because it was a big regeneration project that was. Going forward now, the ones in BT Avenue I've been in personally, and they are quite large. And definitely the ones today, that one of the families I visited today was a woman and a small child, and it's very, very spacious. She's over the moon with it. So I think you're right about the overall regeneration scheme, and we certainly did put less properties on there, but I think there were planning and other issues that constrained us on that development. Going forward now, the newer developments that we're doing, especially the rural ones out at Cannon Pine and Tillington and Birkhill, we've had more control over what we wanted to put there.
Just so that one I just want to give a shout out to private landlords, good private landlords. I'm renting, I've rented since 1996. I've never lived in a house that I owned since 1996. And the landlord I've got at the moment, of the 15 landlords or so that I've had over the years, is by far way above most landlords. And they own, it's the Clay Estate in and around Brockhampton. And they own it's close to 100 properties or something like that. And our rent is very reasonable. We expect to be there until I drop dead. And I think there's a role, and I was seeing this in a couple of Guardian articles recently about not all landlords are bad landlords, particularly in the private sector. And I'm just going to give a shout out to Gino here, because I had a really interesting conversation with him when I first met him. He came to our house. He's a landlord, and I think I would class you in that good landlord thing. I don't know if you want to.
But Will, my
say
issue
about your
with
experience
private
of that.
letting, not individual landlords, it's the fact that because there was so, when we had a big proportion of council houses, they tied down the levels of pricing, but now private rents follow the stupid inflation we have in house prices.
Absolutely.
And that's my issue, it's not individual landlords.
Yeah,
It's
no.
landlords out
I'm
there.
just saying, just giving a general shout out. I think there is room there, and it's interesting if I don't know, clauses we put in for sale that can keep rents low or something. I don't know. What have you got anything that you can say in your experience?
Based in South Wales, so I'm in sort of student kind of market, and I'm regulated by the authority.
Okay, so you are regulated to a degree.
Regulated, you're obviously licensed, and so you're given just case for one kind of market, but then you need to implement obviously a good specification house. So I would live in a house myself, not like rubbish, where which some landlords which is basically wood chip with paper and just low cost kitchens and furniture. Well, it's just it's a wrong way of doing things. You need to spend the money on it, the investment, obviously insulating, good boilers and good kitchens, everything, furniture, by the good standard. So then you'd obviously the tenants would be more respectful to yourself. And I think that's the way to go, really. The legislation just that we have is really quite high. It doesn't really solve standards of the legislation. It doesn't force law, at least right, you need to spend this on it to make it a high standard for living, basically. And you've got to do your care as a landlord to the tenants as well, which is very important.
Is that written in though?
It's not written in law, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, which I would like it to be written in.
So there's a
potential
there to push to increase the standards
it
of
needs to be
private landlords, given that there are so many.
Unfortunately, it's not written in law, so it just doesn't.
There are minimum energy efficiency standards for landlords. They have to
Yes.
EPC level.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there were local rent controls, because that's one of the first things to stop when the Tories came in 1979.
You keep bringing it back to catch, I like it.
But they've got the children of stature in control now.
But that's what we're looking at.
Because of what's happened before.
I think, and whilst it would be lovely to have more residents local and whatever else to this conversation, it shows us if we can gather in a mixture of, you know, different type of housing, and thank you for shouting out for good sort of landlords, because that's got to be part of the mix. I don't think the mixture is the problem. It's what we build and the quality of what we build and who can afford it. And the word regulation is key. There's got to be a degree of regulation. There just has to be. You just have to step in and say that's not going to work. It's totally free. It's got to be a mixture. Bensley, go. Bye, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Cheers, mate. Thank you.
Move on to...
And then we're going to move on to the main, sorry.
The headline act.
The headline act, the pyramid stage, whatever things.
We've been waiting for 3 hours.
We're only here.
Yeah, I know, surely you're all desperate to go home now.
No, actually, we're not now. No. But Nicky, you're going to go home, that's fine.
I need to go, I'm so sorry.
No, so,
Thank you.
thank you so much, Nicky, it's brilliant. Thank you, yeah.
Should I go and stand
Do you
over?
mind?
No, not at all.
You haven't brought anything along with you, have you? I did put a slide up earlier with the 105-page document of the...
Oh, the environmental building standards, yes.
No, just the whole, what's the word?
There's lots of
Consultation.
105-page documents in the council.
No, the consultation.
It's a consultation, the 105-page thing of that. I was just showing that it's on, obviously, on the website to look at, and I know the online board is there, but I guess you're here to sort of explain what that is, and then we can quiz you about it.
Okay, that gives me a good way to kind of start in, I guess, because yes, I haven't brought the presentation, sorry. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. So you know, I'm Amy Chowns, I'm the Cabinet Member for Environment and Economy at Herefordshire Council, and I'm really glad to have those two bits in my portfolio united in one, you know, in one set of work, and I think they're really, really closely linked. I'm sorry I couldn't be here until 8. I was at compulsory governance training, so I came as quickly as I could. So I'm also sorry if I kind of, you know, about what I've missed, because I don't want to trip over and kind of go over stuff that's already been talked about. Mary, obviously you've been doing some stuff, so I'll just say something a little bit briefly and then let's do questions, basically. I think that's probably best. So with regard to housing, there's a couple of kind of big agendas for us as the Green and Independent Coalition Administration in Herefordshire. You know, after years and years of Tory administration and prior to that Tory Lib Dem administration. So it's been a real change, actually, when we took power 3 years ago. And there's a couple of drivers for that. So there's a clear environmental driver about sorting out housing, right? But there's a massively clear social driver about sorting out housing. We've got a real problem with affordability of housing. In Herefordshire in particular, we're particularly bad for affordability compared to the West Midlands and to the national average. We're particularly bad for fuel poverty compared to the West Midlands and the national average. So we've got serious issues of kind of availability of housing and affordability of housing. So one of the things that we were really united to want to do as an administration was to start building council housing again, and we have taken the decision to do that. We took that decision more than a year ago. We are inching towards actually kind of, you know, digging the first foundation and laying the first bricks. It's amazing how long it takes to actually put policies into practice, but that is, you know, a total commitment of ours. And in fact, everybody, every group on the council, every political group was supportive of that, apart from the Conservatives, who thought, we do need more housing, but we really ought to leave it to the market. Failing to acknowledge that the market has completely failed to deliver what we need in terms of housing for decades. Now, for us, building new housing, it has to be affordable and it has to be net zero, because we are all completely passionate about the principle that you don't build stuff that you're then going to have to fix up again 10 years later, right? We're going to build it now, let's build it good, basically. So this was a particular sort of personal, it's like crusade of mine, or kind of, you know, I'm a bit worried with Gavin here, because, you know, he'll then use the word crusade and whatever. Don't use that word, Gavin. You know, it's something I'm very, very passionate about. And what we made sure that we did was we commissioned somebody who really knows about this stuff to help us to write a specification for building affordable net zero houses. And so we've got our own Herefordshire Future Home Standard, because there's actually, like, there's way more than a dozen different environmental building standards, Passive House and BREEAM and LETI and, you know, all sorts of things. So we've looked at that, and we've also looked not just at the environmental, at the energy elements of it, but also at things like open space, like the actual design. People were talking about spaciousness of the rooms in the houses, accessibility for people who've got disabilities, transport facilities and so forth. So we've taken all of that into account and written, you know, our Herefordshire Future Home Standards, which is what our new homes are going to be built to. So I'm just so excited about seeing these new homes. I really, really am. Now, we set an ambition to build 2,500 in 10 years, so at the rate of 250 a year, which is actually what Connexus is planning to do. That is an ambitious ambition, and it's been made particularly difficult because, you know, the council used to own quite a bit of land. They all got sold off before we came to power. All of those farms got sold off. You know, there might have been some great places for building housing there, but we don't have those options. So in terms of sites, we're constrained and we're limited. So there's so much detailed work that's going on to try to make that happen. But the council building new homes can only scratch the surface of what we need to do in Herefordshire. The vast majority of new homes that are built going forward are going to be built by other developers, whether that's kind of social developers like Connexus or private developers. And so it's really important that we use our powers, our regulatory powers such as they are, because unfortunately our regulatory powers are actually quite limited. Basically, you know, the main framework for everything relating to building is kind of national government, but we do have some powers. And so we commissioned a process, again, more than a year ago, this is me kind of jumping up and down about this, to develop what's called a supplementary planning document on environmental building standards, to try to use the powers that we do have to frame and to kind of say to developers, if you're going to build new buildings, they've got to be energy efficient up to X standard. They've got to think about the embodied carbon in the materials that are being used. They've got to think about orientation and all of these sorts of things. A very large document has been produced, which might be the document that you're talking about, which has recently been out to its kind of round of public consultation. I haven't yet seen, you know, all of the feedback that's come in. You know, officers, basically, we direct as politicians and we say we want higher building standards, and the officers kind of go away and do the work. I have absolutely heard the view that that document is far too big. That is also my personal view as well. But you know, we're still in the process of developing it. So the thing that we come up with in the end will be much shorter. The one that we've got for what we're going to build is about 20 pages. You know, we're going to come up with something that is much clearer and shorter, but then it will provide that guidance for developers. Now, supplementary planning documents only have a certain amount of weight in the planning system, and the way to kind of strengthen the weight of what we want to do locally is to put it into our local plan, what has been called the core strategy in Herefordshire. And we're revising that too. It has to be revised every few years anyway. So we're taking this opportunity to really try and integrate some of these key concerns around environmental standards, but also affordability and so forth, into our revision of that local plan. There's been one part of consultation for that. There's now another bit going out at the moment. It's got something like 27 different elements to the consultation. I'm personally, I really sympathise with people who find all of this a bit bewildering and confusing. You know, I find it a bit bewildering and confusing myself too. There's so much. So I completely understand if people can't, you know, everybody can't spend all of the time required to read that, but it is really worth sending your views in my view. Even if all you want to say is, you know, we need housing to be net zero, or we need there to be good transport links for any new housing that's built, or whatever, you know, making your voices heard, because there are these consultation opportunities. If you want to get more deeply involved, please do say so, and kind of, you know, take that opportunity too. That's all about new build. But what about the houses that we've already got? We've got over 85,000 houses in Herefordshire already. They are, again, I said we've got a worse affordability problem, a worse fuel quality problem. We have also got a worse kind of housing stock problem, and that's related partly to the fuel, that's part of the reason for the fuel quality problem. We have, our housing in Herefordshire on average is considerably older than the national average, because, you know, partly we're rural, not urban, so we've got quite a lot of old houses, and they didn't get bombed in the Blitz like, you know, large swathes of urban areas and so forth, and rebuilt. There's a high proportion of detached houses. Detached houses have more of a heating problem because they've got more surfaces to leak from. There are more houses that are not on kind of mains heating systems like gas and so forth, you know, on kind of individual heating systems that are often less energy efficient. So we've got a real issue here. I forget the kind of statistics, and I really must kind of learn this and get it kind of embedded in my house, in my head. But you know, we've got these kind of EPC sort of A down to, in fact, I'm not quite sure where it stops. Mary, you'll be able to tell me F or something.
They go on forever down.
Do they go on forever down?
Right, yeah,
And private rented have got to be EPC or EPC-C or above by 2025, right? We've got a massive proportion of our housing stock that is below EPC-C. I think it's something like, I don't even want to quote it, but it's the majority of our housing is kind of D or below. You know, it's really, really quite bad. Now, so we've got to retrofit, right? Jargon term. We've got to fix up our houses. We've got to insulate them. That is going to cost, not, Vicky was talking about, you know, costing millions, not hundreds of thousands. It's going to cost millions and millions and millions and millions. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds to do it. The housing in Herefordshire, it is going to cost billions upon billions to do it for the houses in the country as a whole, which is another reason why it's so important that any new house built from now on has to be basically net zero carbon, because otherwise we're just storing up more problems for ourselves later on. And it's a crying shame that the government, which previously introduced decent energy efficiency standards, removed them again and still hasn't got around to getting, you know, to putting in place new ones. So in Herefordshire, what can we do about this? Well, we get government funding whenever we can. We've got Green Homes Grant funding. We're quite good at applying for government funding when there are bits of money that come along for fixing up housing. The problem with those is they come with really short time scales. So the whole recent Green Homes Grant debacle, you know, there was a householder part of that scheme, but there was a local authority part of the scheme. And basically they were saying around about June, oh, we'll give you £1 million, but you've got to spend it by the 31st of March next year. And you can only spend it on these types of households that all have to jump through all of these very particular hoops. And so we had problems spending that money. We weren't the only local authority by any means. You know, there were problems spending that money because of the eligibility criteria. People who needed it couldn't get it, and we couldn't find enough households who were eligible who wanted to do it, because it's also, you know, it's disruptive and timing and so forth. But also we did have a problem with the supply chain, because builders generally want to build new houses. They don't generally want to muck about and trying to fix up old houses that, you know, with quite, you know, complicated stuff which maybe they're not terribly familiar with and so forth. So we're trying to do something about this. Tomorrow, at the Cabinet meeting tomorrow, we're going to be taking a decision on a whole package of new measures, including work on energy efficiency. So we're going to, the details, the business case for these projects have to be further developed. But we're going to be paying for training for hundreds of local tradespeople to train up to PAS 2035 and other, you know, recognised industry qualifications, so that they've got qualification to do assessments and to do the work required to insulate homes. We're going to be paying for free home energy efficiency surveys for households that aren't eligible for the national government schemes that have got such tight criteria. But these would be for householders who might be able and willing to mobilise some of their own finance, you know, to do some of these measures if they knew what needed to be done and had a little bit of hand-holding through the process. Ultimately, we would like to be able to give grants to householders as well, but actually, you know, putting in place the financing mechanism for that was challenging. And we've commissioned a strategy to look at ways that we can raise that sort of financing. So we're kind of doing our very best and still open to any ideas anybody has about how we can tackle that, because sorting out housing that we've already got is essential. You know, we had a great presentation from Ben there about heat pumps and changing the types of technology that you use for heating your building, but actually, ultimately, we can't rely on decarbonisation of the grid, we can't rely on decarbonisation of the energy sources only. We also have to be much more efficient in how we use energy. And we've seen that transport and housing, or buildings more generally, are a massive chunk of our carbon footprint and our energy use. Let's try and fix that so that the heating that we put into our houses actually stays in it rather than leaking out the windows and the doors and the chimneys and so forth. That's literally money going up in smoke. So that's what we're trying to do as a council, and I'm really happy to answer any questions or increments.
On a wider point about the consultation, fine, it's online, and I know it's quite a time-consuming process. Was there any thought about doing it in this format, maybe with more people turning up, to actually do it as a, you know, as a town hall type thing, so people actually sit there with, as I understood, some bits of paper and actually could get through, you know, because it's 2-3 hours of your life, isn't it, that you're not getting back.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, say?
Talk youngsters, yeah?
Yeah, I just want these guys, I like them. But yeah, the point is, you know, it's online, isn't it? It's there, but I'm just wondering how engaged people are with it.
It's a really good idea. I've been a cabinet member for 2 years, and I became a cabinet member about 2 weeks before COVID hit. And so, you know, everything changed then in terms of consultations. I remember a few years ago being buttonholed by a council consulting person, literally in Hightown in Herefordshire, you know, talking to me. And none of that has been done because of COVID. But it's a really good point, and I will kind of go back, because our consultations are kind of run by our consultations team. So I will go back to them and sort of say, how about doing this, kind of getting everybody together to talk about stuff. We've done, so for example, when we do budget consultations, the last couple of years, we've done Zoom meetings, and we do things like parish council consultations where reps from the parish council get together, but this sort of thing in a face-to-face room.
Just really quickly, sorry Steve, before, on a link point, which is now, you go first, Steve.
just two very quick points.
Very
quick points. Firstly, I would hope you'll be considering the longevity of the houses. I mean, you look at houses like, you know, the college estate, obviously all sold off now, built in the 30s. A lot of the rural estates built immediately post-war, good for another 100 years. Whereas,
mine will do 500.
yeah, I was going to say with some honourable exceptions like Border Road. I get up on cottage, I was met with total incredulity when I suggested to a range of professionals that really this place has stood for 300 years, I'd like to put it right to the next street. No one designs anything for more than 40 years.
And that's the problem, isn't it? It's not sustainable.
Environmental nightmare. I mean, we've mentioned the Oval. The thing that horrifies me most about the Oval is I can remember those houses being built. I know not all that young, but within my lifespan they were built and knocked down and rebuilt. The council offices where the Old Market development is, they never got 25 years, and they flattened it to build beefy boys. You know, I mean, it's just the awful environmental nonsense of tearing them down and rebuilding. Not your fault, obviously.
No. I completely agree with you. And one of the issues that came up when we've been developing the standards for the housing that we're going to build is the question of what time period you calculate costs over, right? Because I think, you know, sometimes these calculations are done on the basis of an assumption of kind of lifetime of 30 years or 40 years. It's like exactly as you say, you know, you build decent buildings, they'll last for hundreds of years. And when we're considering if it's worth investing a little bit extra, and it's a little bit, right? You know, our standards, applying them currently, the kind of premium for doing that would be between 4 and 8% on the standard cost at the kind of point of construction. But if you think about the money that will be saved by basically very, very low heating bills, and that contributes to the affordability as well. You know, if you calculate that over the lifetime of a house, especially if it's hundreds and hundreds of years, then it's a total no-brainer. The other thing just to say about that is that, so when we're talking about the environmental side of things, you know, people quite often talk about how much energy it uses to heat a house, or, you know, to run your heat pump or whatever, those graphs that Ben was showing us. But it's really critical to think about the embodied energy in a building, and to think about the materials that you're using. So Border Oak is building with oak. It's a fantastic renewable material, incredibly low energy. We've got a building, and I didn't know about this when it was going up, and it can't claim any credit whatsoever. It happened before my time. But the cyber centre on the on Skylon Park down at Longworth, that's a net negative carbon building apparently. Because it's got so much kind of wood in its construction. So, you know, we really got to think about the the materials that we use and the life cycle of those, and like exactly as you say, knocking something down is in virtually every single situation terrible environmentally as well as terrible economically.
Unless you reuse the materials. So if you reuse the materials, you've actually harvested them and then they can be given another life for a longer period of time. So strictly speaking, it's not demolition as such, it's what you do with the materials after you've taken it down.
But they all go to a hole in the ground.
Most people do, but if you could change the mindset and kind of put a value on those materials, then it would be something that people recycled more of things.
Yeah.
I think we need to look to the Scandinavian countries as well, to look at the design of their building, which is highly efficient energy-wise, but it's also community-minded, and the way that they're built is more as a community project, and I don't mean that the community pays for it, I mean that it's built, that it's a community project thing, and everything is there that they need. But we keep building, and there's nothing in these communities afterwards, and this should be incorporated into it. So we build a community around those services, not services around that community, because by then it's too late, we've outgrown it. And that's typical Newton Farm.
I mean, but the success going on to the future is going to depend on if the council is really prepared to use planning legislation to change what developers are doing. You just mentioned about the savings that could be made on an energy efficient house, but those are savings for the occupier, not necessarily savings for the person building the house. But so, for example, starting with something I know, we've got a planning development in my village for 89 houses, which is a lot for our village, but that's by the by. It is a newish application because I think the old one's going to lapse. But at the moment, there's nothing in there about energy efficiency and all the rest. I mean, a lesson has been added since I last looked. I trawled through lots of papers. The only thing about energy efficiency is orientation of roofs. But if you look at the plan, that's as it is at the moment, that's not the case. So, I mean, you are really going to have to be determined.
Wearing my developer's hat, it would be brilliant if you said, as a community, we're not happy with what we've got. Will you come and talk to us, and can we help influence and shape it? Because otherwise, the competitive nature of planning, I can see it's almost getting out of hand, and I feel it myself when I'm doing like 5 or 6 houses. Ask them to come and explain what they're doing, or justify what they're not doing, or tell them what would it take for you as a community to support that application. What do they need to do?
We are waiting for an officer to come and do a presentation.
I mean, from the developer. Get the developer.
But a parish ultimately is only advisory.
So,
but I took part in a recent parish summit which was talking about primarily housing, and I know that there's quite a lot of concern in the county as a whole about the type of housing that's being built, the size of housing, big houses that are not for local people in some of the villages. I mean, I think the local authority are keen for development to be in villages that have already got facilities and whatever, rather than isolated in the...
Can I just say, I checked house sizes on the statistics website today. Herefordshire is just below average for delivery of house sizes. So I think that's probably like a myth that people see a big house. My house is quite big and I built it myself and it's carbon negative and all the rest of it. But people think of it as a big house, but they don't realise I work there.
But I think there's a thing in Herefordshire.
It's just a myth, maybe.
We're a low wage area, but there's quite high disposable household incomes, and the low wages affect the people in the city centres and some of the market towns. Out in the countryside, it's a different matter.
But I think maybe if you looked at it in numerical terms, it's probably not as bad as we all might think. I think just because the big houses are more prominent and you don't judge a block of terraced houses as being a kind of an entity in itself, you kind of think they're small or whatever.
But big or small, if you put them in Kingston to get to work or to do anything at all, other than go to the one pub, you get in your car. So building in the parishes means that it's an environmental nightmare, really. It's encouraging more car traffic.
I really want to respond to some of these points that have been raised. You know, Anna, I completely kind of recognise that issue that you talk about of parishes not actually having really very much power over what developers do. And it's something that we're frustrated with in the council as well, because we also have very limited powers. And so that was what I was trying to explain about putting in place. We've actually sort of had 3 levels of what we've tried to do. When we first came in, we put in place climate and nature checklists, which were basically things that are already supported by policy that we've got in the core strategy, just to remind developers and applicants, you know, have you thought about this, that and the other, including transport provision. But that's got no weight at all. So then there's the SPD. So that's the thing that we've been consulting on recently, and that's kind of an opportunity to push it forward further. And then there is putting it into the core strategy, the local plan, which is where it would have the most weight. So we're trying to kind of push as far as we can. The only way that local authorities can, for example, specify a higher energy efficiency than building regs is by writing it into their local plan. And there are a few local authorities that have done that, and we will do that. And it's only by having planning law, whether it's national law or local policy, that we're actually able to say to developers, no, you have to do this. On the question of where buildings should be, so this is related to the planning consultation that's happening at the moment. There's been 2 stages of that. The one that we've just had is this options analysis for where should the building be. Should it be all in Hereford? Should it be spread around all the market towns, not in the villages? Should it be in the big villages? Should it be absolutely everywhere? Again, you know, people have said to me, oh, it's all quite bewildering, and I do recognise and kind of sympathise with that. But, you know, again, I mustn't sort of say off the top of my head what the outcome of that was. But from memory, it's, you know, the largest sort of, you know, people support the idea that we shouldn't be building loads of houses in tiny little settlements that haven't got services that can support them. Your point about what the Nordics do around kind of building communities, building everything around the services, you know, there's a real tension there, isn't there, with how development works here of, you know, have you got enough spaces in the doctor's surgery? Because we don't have any planning powers to make the doctor's surgery expand. So there's a, you know, that kind of community building model is a lovely one. And just speaking personally, I live in an intentional community, and actually living in a place that is a community more than just a place where different people happen to live next to each other is really, really important for kind of quality of life, I think. On the transport, it's a big challenge in a rural area. You know, we, as you know, as an administration, we are really committed to sustainable transport and not car dependence. We recognise totally people are going to need their cars to some extent. I've driven here today in an electric car that belongs to the carpool that I'm a member of, and those sorts of arrangements are fantastic. We've put money into setting up new carpools. We've set up several new carpools just in the last 6 months around the country. If any of you have got, you know, enthusiasm about setting up a carpool, there's still the potential to do that. So please get in touch and let us know. You need a kind of, you know, a core group of half a dozen basically, but you know, it's a fantastic resource for a community to have, and it makes access to a car much more affordable to people too. But also, you know, promoting walking and cycling. I was in a French city a few weeks ago, and the contrast with, you know, just in the sort of physical space there. You're bang in the middle of the city, and you've got one kind of row of traffic going in each direction, and then what used to be another row of traffic is now a combination of kind of little local parking and cycle paths and all the rest of it, and you've got trams going down the middle over grass kind of thing. You know, what a good transport system that is. Now, it's going to take quite a lot to transform what Hereford's got into a more sustainable transport system. But we've got somebody in place now who is doing that, setting out those plans, that Hereford master plan to sort out the transport. We've had proposals in for sorting out the buses, just really peeved with government because they haven't given money to any of the shires. So, you know, totally recognise that issue and trying really hard to get the funding needed to put it in place.
Being really thick, is a core strategy, once that's done and dusted, that's fixed, and the next administration you're going to have to carry that on, because yes. I've asked you the question I've asked for the councillors is, next May, you're going to have to, you know, be on that pedestal and say, vote for us again, and if you look at Facebook, all everyone cares about is those plant pots anymore. I mean,
sounds awful, but it's, you mean, when there is good work, because this talk our community here, which is a, you know, amazing hubs that put out everywhere, and I do some work for them as well, brilliant, but that gets lost in that argument about plant pots.
That's because the council are not visible. And
Well, that's back to my point earlier about should they be doing consultations that are visible. And
whereas
that,
the planters are.
well, yes. Obviously, also, some of the Facebook, you know, top badge people on things are clearly a bit odd. But, you know, it sounds that noise, and yeah, I mean, people do care about housing, but where are they this evening?
Yeah. Funding for the planters is from a project that was done under the Conservatives, but
Yeah,
it wasn't finished.
but that gets lost in the noise.
And it's from a completely different budget. It's from money that, you know, nothing to do with what we
But
mentioned,
Facebook,
council
Eddie,
tax
says that
and
it's
so
not.
on. I know, exactly. But also, you know, Facebook's a bit of an echo chamber, and
It
you know,
is,
there's
yeah,
kind
it's,
of,
yeah.
there's a bigger picture, and yeah, that's not what I do.
I want something random, not associated with housing, because I once went to a meeting where there was somebody from the council talking about recycling, and they said you can, you know, you have the little triangle with arrows.
Yeah.
They said you could recycle plastics with 1, 2, and now I've forgotten whether it's 4 or 5 or 4 and 5. And I've just had this fanzine from the local council, which doesn't mention this numbering system on plastics. No. So
all our recycling goes into.
Can we try and keep a bit on top?
So, if you've got that sort of question, email the council or email me and I'll pass it on to the right person. I have organised for council waste officers to go out and do briefings in parish councils, and you can actually, I've actually organised visits to the recycling centre. You know, actually the really good headline on the waste is that we used to send as an authority 20% of our waste to landfill, and now, under our new system, it's less than 1%.
Going back to Joe's question.
So you don't know what numbers it is?
My understanding is that it's all plastic, all hard plastic, you can put in the plastic recycling.
Well, it's not
It then goes
polystyrene,
through,
it's
it
not
goes
films.
through, except black. You can't put black plastic in because it goes through.
But it might have changed, of course, but why not tell us? This is a system that's used on a number of plastic packagings and other plastic objects.
My understanding is you can put in all hard plastic into the recycling.
Go on, Nick, ask a last question.
Well, I was going to say that the SPD is one issue in terms of setting those standards. The commitment to building social housing, how secure is that? And reversible might that be?
That's my fear, thank you.
When there isn't enough political will to continue, if there is no political will to continue down that path, have the contracts been signed that say we are committed to, and there will be penalties to pay if we don't go through with it, the new administration would not be able to reverse?
So with every policy is ultimately reversible, right? You know, the bypass had started going down the road and it was reversible.
Don't mention that
No,
word.
exactly.
Frantically writing.
We brought up planters, but don't mention.
We didn't mention it.
Voluntarily, we didn't say anything about it.
No, but my point is, and I'm not speaking to the media or whatever now. I'm just genuinely trying to explain how it is. And every policy of every government or authority is ultimately reversible, right? But one of the things that any administration tries to do is to shift policy in the direction that they want to go. Now, the core strategy will be, again, it has to go through a number of stages, so it won't be finally kind of done and dusted and have all of the rubber stamping done, but it will be very, very close to it by the time of the next election. The housing programme, again, as I've explained, it kind of goes through all sorts of reviews of sites, and we're currently in design for a couple of sites, and then there'll, so there's been procurement of that design work, then there'll be kind of, procurement of the construction companies and so forth. But then, we won't have signed a contract with somebody to build 2,500 houses over the next 10 years. We wouldn't be able to do that. That wouldn't be kind of financially, governance-wise, doable. So all we can do is try and push things in the best direction that we can, as quickly as we can. And things always take a wee bit longer than you hope. But I would say to you, this is a reason for you all to vote Green, right? Or to vote for Kensington.
On that.
I'm teasing. No, I do want to. I just do want to. To vote for candidates in the May 23 elections who will work together for these sorts of policies. I passionately believe in the politics of cooperation. I used to be an MEP. I'm sure some of you know that. I loved working in a political system that was built on consensus building and finding common ground rather than on this argy-bargy. Mary, you were even talking about it in relation to planning. You know, we've got to focus on the common ground that we've got and the common goals that we've got. And so I really hope that in May 23 we are going to be cooperating with everybody that we've got commonalities with. And from my perspective, there's lots of common ground between Greens and Labour. Thank you. So, yeah.
But on that note, are you finding, without naming any individuals, but are you finding any pushback for those sorts of policies that you were talking about earlier?
Yes, yes, of course. I mean, you know, in some ways it's hilarious. You know, at the last, I get really nervous when you're in the room. I use the word like hilarious, and I think, oh no, is he going to write an article that says I said that? But so, for example, at the budget meeting, setting the budget this year in February, we've been through a process. We ran a citizens' climate assembly in January. It was a really kind of great, innovative thing to do. Fantastic representative sample. Came up with loads of great recommendations. This is the cabinet decision we're taking tomorrow on pushing forward with spending £1.33 million on this stuff, which is about doing stuff that's good for the planet, but really, really stuff that is good for people's lives as well, like the home insulation, like improving the improving schools transport. There's a whole big chunk of that money that's going on schools transport, a whole big chunk that's going on tree planting and management. This is stuff people are really passionate about. And yet, at the February meeting, we had people kind of from the Conservative Party opposing doing this stuff, forgetting that they had voted unanimously for us to run a citizens' climate assembly, emulating the one that had been set up by the UK Parliament to consider exactly these issues. So, and these are people, several of them are people who actually voted in March 2019 to recognise the climate emergency, you know. So, for me, the stuff that we're pursuing as an administration in policy terms, improving building standards, for example, is completely consistent with actually saying back in March 2019, yeah, we recognise there is a climate crisis, we've got to do something about it. It's not a distraction from the main business of what we should be doing. It's fundamental to making sure people have affordable, warm, good quality houses that they can get around to their jobs, to meet other people in a way that is affordable and environmentally friendly. So there's always going to be people who criticise. There will always be people who criticise on an ideological basis. But actually, one of the amazing things about the Climate Assembly was this representative sample of people, you know, 80–90% of them on all of these things were saying, yeah, we agree with this stuff. It's really not, these aren't marginal concerns. Yeah. They're a kind of really commonly shared vision of what a good quality life could look like.
So it's a case of ignoring genuine democracy.
Sorry?
It's a case of ignoring genuine democracy.
Well, I think in politics,
people's concerns were, they're not quite as black and white, the concerns that people have.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably worth you saying commonality. It's worth you guys saying, okay, we set this up, and some of the feedback is not 100% on board, but it's coming from people that probably on the same direction. And those are the people you need to kind of converge. Yeah, so the ones that have got an ideological problem with climate change, whatever, then not ignore it, but it's a kind of a side kind of event, isn't it? Because we can't not engage with it. But when you've got pushback from people who are trying to head in the same direction, I think that's where you need to look at, okay, where do we need to get to and they need to get to be able to achieve the same thing we want. Maybe it's the narrative that's coming out or the problems that somebody else can see that haven't been overcome. Because I would say that I'm one of the people that has an element of pushback to some of the things that are coming out. So, and I'm kind of middle of the road, represent other people, I'm sure, that got similar ideas. So I think that's what we have to work on, isn't it? Where we both want to get to the same place, but how do we reflect each other's opinions as well?
Yeah. I think some communities are struggling with the way that you're moving because they're missing the basic fundamental things that a community needs. So whilst you're talking about building up around those communities without those basic needs being met, they can't go to the levels that you want them to go. So we need to get into those communities and say, what is it that you require? And I've been saying this for a long time, but nobody's listening.
So I think that part of what you're talking about is, it seems to me to be about communication, and part of it seems to be kind of about planning policy and kind of what the limits of what we can do. I think
I would appears to be a top-down model rather than a bottom-up, which I've been saying time and time again. We are not getting to the root cause of what is going on with people in communities. So we're thinking at a higher level than a lot of them can even think of, because they haven't got their basic needs being met.
So I think Jo talked about talk community, for example, and we've got something like 50 of these hubs. So, you know, talking about what we're doing as an administration, I think for me as a Green, sometimes we have got a bit of a, maybe even a little bit of a sort of prejudice to overcome, of this idea that if you talk about green issues, you're not concerned with people's real lives. And I hope that, you know, what I've talked about tonight, I've talked about making access to a car in a rural area more affordable with a car club. I've talked about good quality housing that's easy to heat.
Tell me,
those are things
before you go any further, tell me, in these hubs, what percentage of people in the communities are you reaching that you know are not having their basic needs being met? And I mean all your hubs right across the county.
I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know
you
the number.
don't know. None of the hubs know.
No,
So it's time that you actually started to assess what you're doing and get into those communities and to find out what those needs are.
So can I give you a few examples of, I think, how we have tried to do that? I think you're absolutely right that there's always people who are kind of not reached. And there are a lot of people who are struggling at the moment. My argument would be that that is entirely due to national policy. You know, when Conservative colleagues talk to me about the cost of living and, you know, the difficulties that people are having affording paying council tax, for example, why are they facing cost of living problems? It's because of the hike in national insurance, it's because of the removal of universal credit supplements, it's because of the hike in the fuel. But if I can just kind of give you some examples of how our administration has taken what I think is a very different approach to what previous Herefordshire councils would have done. So if you just think about the money that we had some additional COVID recovery money. We took a decision last July about what to do with the COVID recovery money that we had, you know, remaining after we paid out all of the grants and all of those sorts of things. What did we do with that? We did free kind of paying for free business space for people to try setting up new businesses and new premises. We did employment, getting people back into employment. We paid for that. We paid for mental health support. We paid for free swimming lessons. We paid for free access to leisure centres for all young people. We spent £1 million on a project to get people back into our town centres, to kind of rejuvenate the town centres. Now, the proposal that originally came from officers was just to put free car parking for a year. And we said, that doesn't fit with our sustainable transport vision, but also it doesn't benefit the people who are most struggling. If you look at the Hereford Transport Strategy, you'll see there are parts of South Wye where 50% of households do not have access to a private car. You know, in our most deprived communities, people are less likely to drive. So by investing that money, which is what we did, in free weekend buses all over the place and putting on extra Sunday buses and so forth, and investing a bit of it in the expansion of the barrel scheme, what we were doing was putting money into something that benefited people who are struggling more rather than people who are struggling less. Another example is what we did with the shop local card. Again, the proposal that originally came was, let's do Eat Out to help out, you know, like Rishi Sunak did. And I said, no, you know, this is my portfolio area, so I could say, no, you know, A, that was terrible in terms of spreading COVID. B, it benefits people who can afford to eat out and who kind of have a habit of doing that. Let's do something that spreads the money around everybody equally, and that spreads the money around businesses more equally. So it's not just cafes and bars that get the money, but actually it's all sorts of retailers. And so that's what we did with the shop local card. And you know, every policy has its glitches, you know, there were some challenges with that too, but actually it was a far better way of spending money than the sort of default option would have been. So I think that you're absolutely right that we're not reaching everybody.
but we are really, really trying wherever we have scope and space. Another example actually is the Towns Fund, this great big, 22.4 million capital project. Under old kind of ways of doing things, then this might easily have been spent on some sort of big, all singing, all dancing project that somebody has sort of taken off the shelf. And we said, no, we really want the community to have a voice in this. We did loads and loads of consultation. This isn't kind of driven by the council, but we're a really key stakeholder in this. And as a result, we've got a fantastic, diverse portfolio of things that's going to be new sports facilities, gardening, skills training, revitalised learning centre, fantastic, all singing, all dancing library, but, only part of it. So I think we're trying really hard, but we've got that flexibility. But actually, basically 2/3 of what the council spends money on, aside from the education budget, is spent on children in care and adults who need care. The very, very vulnerable elderly and adults with disabilities and other care needs. And that, you're talking about kind of communicating what we do. The vast majority of people do not know that. The vast majority of people think that what the council does is planters and, building new roads and collecting the bins and fixing
But
potholes.
with the cost of living crisis coming down the road, it's predicted. It's not guaranteed, is it? Because things can change.
Can I?
But it's predicted.
Yeah. Just like conscious of time and that the two small children here are here to lock up and they're not going to bed because we're still here. Personally, I think what this current administration is doing is really, really good on the whole. It has had a few issues and I think they're going to need our support personally. I'm doing lessons on this that are going into school so that kids go home and tell more of their parents about these hubs because I think they're really good. So, and it is new, to be fair. And that is, so I'm making those lessons, I made the lessons, they're rolling out to school. So, these things can happen, but I think you're right, we need to find a bit more kind of on this common ground so we can really move forward. Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of this is going to take Will about 4 million years to pack this away. But thank you so much, and I hope it's been of interest. And I'm just astounded again that what I think has been a great debate would have been really great for loads of people across the county to listen to. There's not more.
Well, let's try and promote it a bit with YouTube.
It sort of astounds me really, because how,
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone that's turned up to talk to us today. That's been great.
And I'd love to invite you to a green meeting in return. We've got a meeting in Kington on Saturday with Natalie Bennett, who's one of our
I'm going to see Gary
team
Newman
leaders.
Saturday.
Gary Newman, can't compete. Anyway, it's on farming and averages, futures for farming and averages, so you're very welcome.
Sorry, but no.
and we have our Return to the Rivers event in June the 25th. Location to be solved, but that's the next thing. And we've got some very good speakers and some quite good things going to happen. That one's going to be good. So that's our second Rivers meeting. Just checking in on the Vara Foods and everyone else to make sure they've started doing what they've promised. Yes.
Will there be a summary of what the speakers have said tonight?
From tonight, there'll be a summary of it. Yeah, if you watch it on YouTube, we'll put it on. I'm not typing it up.
And also, other meetings we've got in the works is one on transport, and another one on violence against women and girls, which will be happening in September.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Sorry, nice people in Kevin. Sorry, Nick, that we didn't. Are you okay with? Thank you so much.